I am a wolf who has wandered for years, accustomed to a life of solitude. But when I was invited to join another pack by their leader, I fell into a dilemma. I was afraid of getting hurt again, but deep down, I craved a sense of belonging. When I saw the children's acceptance of me, I began to waver. Should I accept the invitation and rejoin a group? Chapter 1. For long years, I had roamed the dense, shadowy forest since leaving the pack that raised me. My once pristine white fur was now dulled and matted from constant travel through the wilderness. As the unnamed protagonist, I moved with practiced caution across the forest floor, each paw placement deliberate to minimize noise. My survival instincts, honed by years of solitude and minimal combat training, kept me vigilant. I alternated between sniffing the ground for unfamiliar scents and swiveling my ears to catch any suspicious sounds, always wary of encroaching on another pack's territory. However, my luck seemed to have run its course. In a moment of distraction, I found myself suddenly encircled by at least 6 imposing wolves, their sizes slightly surpassing my own. Their coats ranged from midnight black to earthy brown and various shades of gray, blending seamlessly with the forest's muted palette. The pack's aggressive stance, with bared teeth and challenging snarls, sent a jolt of fear through my body. Instinctively, I dropped to the ground, pressing my belly against the cool earth. My tail curled tightly against my flank, and I lowered my head onto my paws, flattening my ears in a clear display of submission. I could feel my body trembling as I peered up at the hostile group with wide, anxious brown eyes, dreading what fate awaited me now that my peaceful existence as a rogue wolf had been shattered. Although none of the surrounding wolves exuded the commanding presence of an alpha, their unified front clearly indicated they belonged to an established pack. My mind raced, trying to discern which pack I had unwittingly stumbled upon. From among the warriors, a dark gray wolf with a distinctive black spot over his right eye emerged. This wolf, who I would come to know as the dark gray wolf, exuded an air of authority as he broke from the circle. With calculated steps, he began to circle my quivering form, fighting against my submissive posture. I cautiously turned my head to track his movement, careful not to make any sudden moves that might be perceived as a threat. The tension in the air was palpable as I awaited the pack's next move, acutely aware of how quickly my solitary existence could come to an end. Without warning, he snapped at my tail, spooking me enough where I jumped and spun around slightly to watch him as he and his pack mates slightly glanced around at each other as they were obviously communicating through their pack link. After a few minutes, they seemed to have decided what to do with me, or at least received an order from a higher command, because suddenly the wolf that had been circling me began stalking towards me, as did a few of the others who were behind him, getting the message that I was to go with them. I slowly stood to my feet, keeping my head down to show I was no threat. I followed the few warriors ahead of me towards wherever they were taking me, while the rest followed behind. As we drew closer to where I was certain the pack lived in the territory, I could smell salt water. My sense of smell was proven correct once we cleared the trees and entered the clearing the pack house and other smaller homes sat. The ocean in the background behind the pack house itself. There were people outside, moving about as the group of wolves continued to herd me towards the front of the pack house. Those outside, mainly women and small children, stopped to watch as we passed. Many mothers quickly grabbed their kids, keeping them close by as they obviously didn't know if I was a threat to them or not. I would turn my head slightly, looking at some of the people I'd pass by, while keeping my head low in fear of getting attacked for seeming like a threat to the pack. As we drew nearer to the pack house, the front door to the large structure opened and out stepped an older man. I'd say about maybe close to his mid-40s or so. As we got closer, I could make out that he had shoulder-length brown hair, but at the moment that's really all I could see without seeming like I was challenging him. Once reaching the front of the house, the few warriors that were in front of me moved so there was nothing standing between me and their alpha while he glared down at me before tossing a plain white t-shirt towards me that was obviously long enough to cover everything that needed to be covered. "Shift," he commanded. His voice was deep and held authority in its tone. Imagining my human form, I felt my bones breaking and realigning in my body the way they should be for a human, and before long I was standing in front of the alpha and bactenses. Quickly reaching forwards, I grabbed the shirt he had tossed me before and slipped it over my head before pulling my long brown hair out through the neck of the shirt. Once the shirt was situated and I was sure it wouldn't cause me to flash someone accidentally, I kept my eyes to the ground and waited for him to speak to me. "What is your name, Rogue?" he said, his voice laced with anger, which I knew probably wasn't exactly directed at me. "Just all rogues in general." "Riley Black, sir," I answered quickly as I still avoided eye contact with him. "Why were you in my territory?" he asked, voice still holding the same anger to it, as I heard his pack gathering around to see what was going on. "I'm sorry," I whimpered out as I feared for my life. "I thought I was staying out of any pack's territory. I didn't mean to wander in. I was simply passing through, sir." I spared a glance around at the members of his pack as I waited for his decision as to what to do with me. Some of the older women of the pack were looking at me with pity, probably thinking I was a young girl who didn't deserve whatever their alpha was going to do to me. The sound of a clearing throat caused me to snap my attention back in front of me to the man who was about to decide my fate. Keeping my head down, I slowly lifted my brown eyes only to look at the man in front of me. My brown ones instantly locked with a pair of baby blue eyes that didn't look angry. They just looked to hold fear that he wouldn't be able to protect his pack. But there was also determination there that he would. "I have come to a decision," he said as I lowered my eyes and waited to hear my fate from him. "You will stay here for the night. But you must understand that you will be placed in a holding cell just as a precaution for my pack's safety." My head shot up as I looked at him, nodding. The sound of breaking bones surrounding me as his warriors shifted into their human forms. When I looked around, the warriors that had been surrounding me were all shirtless with either basketball shorts on or some loose-fitting jeans. Two of them walked up beside me as their alpha continued to stand there on the porch of the pack house while they grabbed a hold of my upper arms and began pulling me inside the house. I kept my eyes to the floor, figuring they wouldn't want me looking around too much if I'm not staying here longer than the night that was offered. Upon entering the basement level of the house where the cells were, I was taken to one, but not before I could see other rogues occupying some of the cells down here, and most in silver chains. After pushing me into an empty cell, the two warriors walked off while their alpha stayed behind after the cell door was closed and locked. I felt his gaze on me as I looked around the cell that would temporarily be my home for the night. I was trying not to look over at him. It felt weird to say the least after 4 years of being rogue. "Why do you do it?" his voice said into the silence, and causing me to turn my attention finally to have my brown eyes locked with his blue ones. "Sorry," I said, tilting my head to the side in complete confusion. "Why do you go rogue?" he asked before I lowered my eyes from his and looked away, turning my back on him. "Long story," I muttered out before I heard him sigh behind me. "Something I don't exactly talk about." "I'm sure you could understand that, sir." "How long were you out there?" he asked, changing the direction of the conversation from why I was to how long I was. "About 4 years, maybe," I said, looking over at him to see he wasn't standing like the big bad alpha he probably should be around rogues. I didn't really get to keep a calendar on me at all times while I was alone. "You never considered joining another pack?" he asked, cocking his head to the side curiously. "I tried to stay away from them," I said as I walked over to the bars and placed my hands on them. "Most packs don't take kindly to rogues. Figured your pack would be one of them with the way your warriors surrounded me. I am sorry that I crossed into your territory. I was trying to avoid doing something like that at all costs. You're welcome to join us, Ms. Black," he said, backing away from the cell. "I can see that you're of no real threat to the pack, and I think many others would look down upon me, either killing you like most strokes suffer or turning you back loose out there. We can talk more on it in the morning, once you've had a decent night's rest. One of my warriors will be down here with you, to keep you company, if you will." "Wait," I called after him when he headed towards the stairs. "Yes," he asked, looking back at me. "You know my name, but I don't know yours," I said as I watched a smirk grow onto his face. "You can call me Norman," he said, smiling at me before he continued on his way up their stairs, leaving me alone in his little dungeon with all the other rogues. Chapter 2. It was maybe about 30 minutes or so before another wolf walked down the stairs and over to where my cell was at the end of the small corridor in the dungeon. They send up down here to watch over rogues. One of the rogues near me called out as the boy got closer to my cell. This pack is pathetic. I was sat on the small cot in the cell with my legs pulled up to my chest and my arms around them, while still wearing just that shirt Norman had tossed out to me when I was first brought up to his pack house. I glanced over at the boy, close to my age by the looks of him, as he came to a stop in front of my cell and looked to me almost apologetically. I smiled weakly at him before turning my head and lifting my arms up to my hair and pulling it all onto one shoulder as I sat staring at my bare knees in front of me. I kept my gaze on my knees as I thought about everything that's ever happened to me to lead me to be here at this point in time. "What's your name?" I asked out in a whisper, not lifting my gaze to look at him as I'm sure he turned his attention to me as soon as I spoke up. "Matt," he said as I heard him walk closer to the cell door. "Matt Boomer." "Well, Matt Boomer," I said with the hint of a smile crossing my lips for a second before it disappeared. "Why were you chosen to be my guard?" "I'm not your guard exactly," he said. "I'm more or less your company until morning when you'll be taken up to Alpha Norman's office." My head turned slightly and my gaze went the rest of the way before locking eyes with him. "Are they going to force me to stay with this pack?" I asked as I watched him. "Or will they allow me to leave if I so choose?" "Alpha said that is your choice to make," he said, looking at me still as I slowly turned my attention away from him and back to my knees. "But he said the offer to join is still open. Even if you decide to leave but then want to come back, he'd allow it. He says that no one deserves to be rogue if they truly don't want to be. Your Alpha really is trusting, isn't he?" I asked, glancing over with my eyes for a second before looking away. "And fast with the trusting too. Just moments before his offer he thought I was a danger to his pack. Now he's offering me a place among them. You're not like the other rogues we've come into contact with, really," Matt said as I looked over at him again. "And you look like you could use some social encounters again." "After everything I went through, Matt," I whispered. "I don't think it'd fit in with a pack anymore." "Why?" he asked, and I looked away and lowered my head. I figured nothing good comes from being in one. Not for me anyway. When I glanced up after he stayed silent, I noticed the confused look on his face. Taking a deep breath, I moved my hair further out of the way and pulled down one shoulder of the large shirt to reveal what was hidden on my upper back. "Scars. Who did that to you?" he asked as I watched his expression turn to rage as his eyes went black. "My mate," I said as I pulled the shirt back over my shoulder and added back to where I had it. "And his friends before he rejected me. I was 19 when they started and I cowed and get away until I was 22. The bruises are all gone, but the scars and the memories are still there and haunt me. That is why my decision for the question your Alpha will ask me is pretty obvious. You'll go back to being a rogue and trying to steer clear of other packs. You should tell Alpha Norman," he said, and I could feel his eyes boring into my side as I continued to look away from him. "He wouldn't make you leave knowing what you've been through." "That's exactly why I won't tell him," I said, looking over at him. "It'll just be one more burden your Alpha doesn't need. I'm better off on my own anyway. I'm sorry really, but the Alpha would be furious with me if I didn't inform him," Matt said just as I glanced over at him to see his eyes glaze over as I realized what he was doing. He was contacting his Alpha through their pack, Lincoln telling him what he had just found out about me. Looking away from him, I pulled my leg closer to my chest and rested my head on the tops of my knees. I was now forced to stay here. His Alpha would be considered out of his mind if his pack found out he let a young girl who was abused leave. I no longer had a choice in whether I could leave or stay. But was I ready to live with a pack again after 4 years being Rogan, then about 4 years of being abused by my previous pack? I sat there, Matt making no move to try and talk to me after he contacted his Alpha. But it wasn't long before I heard another set of footsteps enter the dungeon. "The Alpha wants to see her," a voice said that I didn't recognize, and obviously I couldn't see the face behind the voice. Glancing towards Matt, I watched him nod to whoever had just spoken before their footsteps retreated out of the dungeon and Matt walked to the cell door and unlocked it. "Come on, really," Matt said as I looked over to him and nodded before standing cautiously to my feet, as I remember all I was wearing was this large shirt. He allowed me to exit out of the cell and head towards the stairs that exited the dungeon before he followed behind me, keeping quiet. I was beginning to think maybe he thought I was mad at him for telling his alpha about me, but I wasn't. I understood he had to, and I would never hold that against him. The walk through the pack house and up even more stairs to the floor the office was on was quiet, and I could feel members of the pack with their gazes on me. It was an uncomfortable feeling to say the least, but I was going to show how uncomfortable it made me. Most of these wolves still didn't like that I was dead yet, like most rogues other than the few down in the dungeon, but I think those were held for questioning and would be disposed of as soon as their usefulness disappeared. My wolf was howling at me to raise my head high and stop looking weak to the pack, but my for years as a rogue with no skills whatsoever turned me into a submissive wolf that didn't want trouble. My wolf would have been Luna, and she didn't like the glares that she was receiving from the pack as we passed through the main open floor of the ground level before heading up the stairs. It took all my willpower not to allow her to surface and attempt to place them all in their place when we weren't even a part of the pack to begin with. I followed quietly behind Matt, trying not to lose sight of him and be left alone with a pack that still didn't like me because I was a rogue. My bare feet made the most noise as we walked down the silent hallway, once reaching the floor the office was on. "Matt, I hope you don't think I'm mad with you," I said as we continued to walk, him slowing his pace when I spoke up. "If you are, you have every right to be," he said, lowering his head but still refusing to look at me. "I'm not," I said, grabbing his arm gently and stopping him so he'd turn and finally look at me. "You did what you felt you had to, because if you hadn't, I certainly wouldn't have. I was planning on leaving and not telling a soul what I went through. But now you're about to be forced to stay in a pack," he said, shaking his head. "I would have eventually joined a pack again if I felt safe enough to do so. I don't see your alpha laying a hand on me to harm me. Do you?" He looked at me and quickly shook his head while I smiled. "He'd never lay a hand to hurt anyone who was in his pack," he said with confidence. "Exactly," I said, smiling. "So it would probably be for the best that I joined a pack like this one instead of one that would bring even more harm to me." He beamed at me before looking ahead of us, causing me to follow his gaze until I spotted the large set of double doors at the end of the hallway. "That's his office," he said as he glanced back down at me. "HS expecting you." I looked back over at him and watched as he turned and headed back down the stairs, leaving me alone in the silent hallway. Taking a deep breath, I looked back to the double doors before slowly making my way to them. I could easily smell him on the other side of the doors, the scent strong as he must pen inside the room. That was the job of the alpha, spending all his time working over things that related to the safety and well-being of his pack. And had I become Luna in my last pack, it would have been my job to help out in every way I could, in any way possible. I could feel my wolf whimper at the memory of our mate rejecting us, but I had accepted that the day he started beating me like I was a punching bag, shaking my head to clear my thoughts about the past that was never going to change. I took another deep breath before I raised my hand to knock on the set of doors in front of me. I didn't have to wait long before I heard his voice from the other side of the door. "Come on in, Ms. Black," he called out as I looked down to the handles of the doors before me, gripping one firmly. I pushed the door open and peered into the office, instantly being greeted with his now strangely familiar scent in just under a day. When I looked up, I was met with his deep baby blue eyes that seemed to be searching my soul at that very instant. "I'm glad you could make it up," he said, and stood behind his desk before motioning to a chair in front of him. "We have some things to discuss this morning, Ms. Black." Chapter 3. I took a seat across from Norman, his work desk seated between us, as I pulled the shirt down over my knees as far as I could so that I didn't accidentally flash him. "It has come to my attention that there is something you have been keeping from me in regards to your past with your old pack." He started once he sat down in his chair behind the desk. "Now I understand that it is painful for you to talk about, really. But after what Matt told me, I can't just let you leave and live back out there in that world when you've already had to deal with enough pain. Please accept my offer to join the pack. Because of my past, it makes it hard for me to be able to live happily in a pack alpha," I said as I kept my voice steady and low to show the respect he deserved. "I told you, really," he said, Call me Norman. I've been without a pack for 4 years, I said, and I don't think your pack would openly accept a rogue such as me who is damaged. On the contrary, he said, looking at me as he rested his elbows on his desk and placed his chin on his hands. I've had many come to me ever since your arrival asking if I was going to kill you or force you back out of the territory. Many of them don't want hither alternative. They want you to live here among us because they neither seen or sense any threat from you. Just a kind soul, who needs a second chance at being able to be a part of a loving pack. I looked down at my hands that I had placed in my lap, looking away from his intense blue eyes that seemed to wander deep into my soul just from one look. Riley, I will not force you, he said after a few minutes when I made no move to speak up. But I would highly suggest you take my offer. I know of many packs out there who do not give rogues second chances at being in a pack. I looked away from him as I knew what my answer would be. I had all but told Matt out there in the hall that I would accept his alpha's offer. I just didn't know how to tell him. I guess when I moved my head, some of my hair didn't fall over my shoulder and exposed the back of my neck, because a few seconds later, he was out of his seat and walking around his desk towards me. May I see, really? He asked with a cautious voice as I looked up at him to see he had what appeared to be sadness and almost pain in his eyes at finally seeing the scars just visible above the collar of the shirt. Nodding, I lifted my hands up and pulled my hair the rest of the way over my other shoulder before gently tugging the collar of the shirt down over my shoulder some to expose more of the scars. I looked up at him with my eyes as I tilted my head to the side slightly. I lowered my gaze when I noticed his left hand reaching out cautiously to the collar of the shirt. I turned my head a little more to the side before closing my eyes just as fingers brushed the skin just above the collar of my shirt. As his fingers continued to lightly graze over some of the slightly raised scars, I kept my eyes closed and took a deep breath before I spoke up. I accept your offer to stay and join your pack, Alpha Norman. I whispered out and only opened my eyes when his hand stilled on my shoulder. I lifted my brown eyes to have them lock with his blue ones as he seemed to slowly process what it was that I had said just seconds ago. I watched as a small smile graced his lips before his eyes glazed over just as Matt's had we contacted his alpha through the mind link. He had removed his hand from my shoulder, and when he was finished contacting whoever, he walked back behind his desk and sat down while leaving me there to figure out what to do now. Before I could figure anything out, there was a knock at the closed door behind me. Come in, he answered just as the door opened to reveal a woman a few years younger than me. You called for me, she asked, looking from Norman then down to me where I still sat. Riley, this is my younger cousin, Jenna, Norman said, drawing my attention away from the new face. You met her mate last night. Matt. Jenna, I want you to take Riley here and help her get some clothes and pick out a room here in the pack house. Of course, she said, smiling at Norman before looking to me again. Come on, Riley, let's get you something to wear other than that shirt my dorky cousin decided to toss at you yesterday afternoon. I heard that, Jenna. I heard Norman playfully growl out behind me as I stood up, so cautious that I didn't flash him. That was the point. Jenna said, laughing as she pushed me out of the office and closed the door before something else could happen between her and her cousin. I looked back at her as I raised one eyebrow at her and a small smile on my face when she turned to face me. Sorry, I always tease him like that, she said, smiling as she came to stand beside me. Ever since his mate and wife died a few years ago in a rollback, I do any and everything I can to cheer him up and keep him from stressing himself out too much. I'm sorry to hear about the Pax Luna, I muttered softly as I lowered my head some. We're getting by, but our Luna didn't give him an heir to the pack, she said, still standing in the same place. They were trying, but she didn't manage to get pregnant before she was killed, and he doesn't believe in those second chance mates, so HES never really moved on from her. I looked down at my feet. Everyone who believed in it found their second chance mates, but if you didn't believe and continued to hold on to the pain from the loss of your mate, you'd never find that mate. Hey, do you mind if we stop somewhere before we get you some clothes? She asked after a few seconds, causing me to lift my head up. Of course not, I said, shaking my head as she smiled and grabbed my wrist before pulling me out of the pack house and leading me down the path into all these houses that the pack lived in. Come on, follow me, she said, smiling as she glanced back before running up the steps to one of the houses and through the front door, where I instantly stopped. not sure if I should follow her inside. I looked around outside, feeling like everyone was watching and judging as I stood there on the porch in nothing more than a shirt before I heard footsteps come back to the door. "Riley, come on, it's okay," she said, smiling as she grabbed my wrist and pulled me over the threshold of the house. "Mama, where are you?" "In the kitchen, Jenna." I heard a female voice call out as Jenna smiled back at me and pulled me into the kitchen with her, where an older woman was standing with her back to us. The kitchen smelled so homey just with her there cooking. Everything homemade. "Oh, who's this?" the woman said after turning around to spot the two of us in the doorway, and I immediately felt awkward because of how I was dressed. "This is really," Jenna said, smiling over at me as her mother looked to me and smiled as well. "Just the rogue that was brought in late yesterday evening. Now where is he?" I think she was talking to herself because before anyone could answer, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone to stand there awkwardly. I kept my head down, my hair resting over my shoulders as I waited for Jenna to come back. Her mother turned back to what she was doing before we walked in and just left me to stand there. "Here we are," I heard Jenna's voice say as she came walking back into the room, causing me to lift my head up to look and see she had a little boy in her arms. I smiled at the baby in her arms as his little brown eyes locked on me. "Meet Layton," she said, smiling down lovingly at the baby. "Mine and Matt's baby boy." Mama was babysitting him while I went to see what exactly Norman needed from me. "Is adorable," I said, smiling at the baby, then looking up at Jenna. "How old is he?" "About 6 months," she said, smiling up at me before looking at what I was wearing. "Some of my old clothes are still here. Let's see what we can find to put on you until we can get you your own clothing to wear. Shall we?" I nodded and she turned to lead the way up the stairs to where I'm guessing her old room was when she lived here with her parents. "Okay, so some of my things will probably be a little big on you, but they're only temporary anyway," she said as she opened a door and walked inside with me right on her heels as she walked over to her closet. I watched as she dug through her closet with Layton on her hip, who was watching me intently, having never seen me before. He was quite curious. "Here we go," she said, pulling out a couple things. She pulled out another oversized shirt and some jogging pants before laying them down on the bed. "I'll leave you to get changed," she said, turning to face me. "Just come back downstairs when you're done, then we can head out to get some shopping done before taking you back to the pack house to pick out your room." "Thanks," I said as she nodded and left, closing the door behind her before I turned back to the clothing on her bed. I couldn't understand how these people were so kind to someone they've never met before today. Pushing the thought from my head, I walked over to the bed and looked down at the things she laid out for me. Pulling off the shirt I was wearing, I noticed a mirror over on the other side of the room. Before pulling the new clothes on, I made my way over to the mirror and turned my back to it, lifting up my hair to look at the healed scars that litter a good portion of my back. Each one was a pain-filled memory of what I last remembered of pack life. I went rogue when I had finally had enough of the abuse, all of the pain they caused me, dropping my hair back down and turning away from the mirror. I wiped away the forming tears from my eyes and walked back over to the side of the bed that held the clean clothing on. I had made a promise to myself that night for years ago that I'd never join another pack, and now here I was, doing just that. But I wouldn't have done this if I didn't feel like I could trust them when they all seemed to trust me. Now I just have to hope I didn't make a mistake by agreeing so easily to stay. Chapter 4. It's been about a week since I joined Norman's pack. I picked out my room at his pack house that same day after Jenna, and I got me a change of clothes and went shopping for new ones. My room I picked out was on the main floor of the pack house towards the back. It had cream-colored walls and off-white colored carpet, along with a twin-size bed in the back left corner that ran along the back wall from the door entering the room itself. I didn't have any belongings really other than the clothes I bought with Jenna, so my walls and bedside table are both bare, with nothing to show my life history from before my years as a rogue. Most of the pack has seemed to welcome me in with open arms as well, though I think that originally found me are still a little cautious about me, which I can completely understand. I've mostly been left to myself since joining the pack, although Jen and Matt come visit me in my room most days with their little bundle named Layton. I was just sitting in my room, on my bed with a couple books I had been given a few days ago, when in walked Jenna. Yeah, sure, come on in, I said sarcastically as I glared at her. Don't even worry about knocking. Okay, I'll remember that, she said with a smirk while my glare grew. Come on, you're helping me with the kids today. What? I said as she pulled the book I had been reading out of my hand and grabbed my wrist to pull me off my bed. Because Norman thinks you're spending too much time in your room, she said, pulling me out the door and down the hallways. And I agree. You need to get out more. Meet the pack. Jenna. I groaned out as she pulled me out of the pack house and towards where some of Vak's kids were playing around, waiting for Jenna and now apparently me to arrive. I looked around at all the kids as we came to a stop and their attention turned to us. Most of the kids were young, between 3 years and 8 years of age, but there were some who were older. I spotted a 13-year-old girl holding Leighton in her arms as they surrounded us. Jenna? A small blonde-haired, green-eyed girl said, running up to Jenna and myself with a smile on her face as she jumped into Jenna's arms. Hi there, Abigail, Jenna said, smiling at the girl before they both looked to me. This is my friend, really. Hi, Ms. Riley, Abigail said, smiling warmly at me, which I couldn't help but return. Hi, Abigail, I said, smiling and kneeling down as Jenna set her on her own 2 feet. And how old are you? 5, she said brightly as she held up 5 fingers on her hand to show me. You're a big girl then, aren't you, Abigail? I said, smiling warmly at her as she beamed up at me and nodded. There's my cute little baby, Jen echoed as she took Leighton from the 13-year-old girl who had been holding him. I watched with the smallest pang of jealousy as Jenna held her son close to her and nuzzled her face to him. Ms. Really? Abigail asked, tugging on my hand to grab my attention. Yes, Abigail, I asked, smiling down at her. What does your wolf look like? She asked sweetly as her big green eyes looked up at me with complete innocence in them. She's big and white, I said, smiling down at the girl. And I've even told her eyes are brown just like my own are. Can we see her? A little boy with brown hair asked, walking up to stand beside Abigail in front of me. Unsure, I looked over to Jenna to see if it was all right. I wasn't sure about how things went in this pack, and I also wasn't sure if any of the mothers of these kids would appreciate a former rogue being in their wolf from around their kids. It'll be fine, really, Jenna said, smiling. You can go behind that tree and shift. Nodding, I stood up from the 2 small children in front of me and walked over to where the trees were and quickly stripped down before shifting into my white wolf. Grabbing my clothes in my muzzle, I quickly made my way back out to where the kids were. I instantly heard giggles coming from the younger ones as I placed my clothes next to Jenna before turning my attention to them all. My wolf was singing with joy as I laid down on my belly, and the children all began running over to me before climbing on every part of me that they could reach. My tail was wagging slightly behind me as I looked around at all the young children surrounding me. I looked to my left just as Abigail came walking around my face, smiling. You're beautiful, beamed at me as she patted my snout. My tail wagged more before I felt something clamp down around it, causing me to turn my head sharply and look back to see that little boy who had asked to see my wolf had decided he wanted to play with my tail. Looking back to Jenna, she started laughing at the sight of me covered in children, all happy that I was there for them to play on. Back at my old pack, before everything that happened with me finding my mate and being rejected, I had always loved being around the kids and keeping them happy. My wolf was humming with happiness from being accepted into a pack once again. Even though I had been rogue for so long, it felt nice to be among others, and I had to take Jenna and Norman most of all for it. Okay, children, Jenna said after a while, still smiling down at where I lay. Let's let Ms. Riley get up and shift back to her human self. There was a chorus of AWS as they one by one climbed off of me, allowing me to finally stand and make my way with my clothes to the tree, where I shifted back and placed my clothes back on my body. We stayed with the children for a little while longer after I shifted before we slowly headed back up to the pack house. Thanks for that, I said to Jenna as we walked up the grassy path. I think I really needed that. It was no problem, she said, smiling widely as I glanced up and caught sight of Norman standing in one of the windows staring down at Jenna, Leighton, and myself as we walked. Glancing over at Jenna, I could tell she was having a conversation with someone through the mind, like as her eyes seemed to glaze over and stare off ahead while not really seeing anything. "Hey, really?" Jenna said after a few minutes when we were nearing the door to the pack house. "Your mate from your old pack. What was his title?" "He was an alpha," I said, looking down to my feet as I tried hard to keep the hurt I felt and the betrayal I felt when he along with his friends abused me before I got away. Glancing over at Jenna, she didn't say anything else before excusing herself, saying she needed to get home and put Leighton down for his nap and start supper for her and Matt. Nodding, I smiled weakly and waved to her before I walked in through the front door of the pack house and slowly made my way to the hall that led to my room. "Riley?" a voice said from the stairs as I was walking past them. Looking up, I spotted Norman standing at the top looking down at me. "Yes, Alpha?" I asked, looking up to him as I wondered what he needed. "Could I speak to you in my office for a moment, please?" he asked as I nodded and made my way up the stairs before following him to his office. I was sure if maybe I was in trouble for shifting around the kids earlier when Jenna said it would be okay. "Don't look so tense, really," he said, smiling back at me as we entered his office and I went to the seat I had sat in the day he offered me a place in his pack. "Why did you want to speak with me?" I asked nervously. "You're not in trouble, so please relax," he said as he sat down on the other side of the desk in his office. "I wanted to talk to you about something." "Okay?" I asked, looking at him confused. I hadn't been in this pack barely a week and he wanted to talk to me about something. "I don't know if you realize the reason behind it, but I asked Jenna to ask you the title of your former mate had you not been rejected by him." Norman started off casually and almost cautiously. "Why?" I asked as I tilted my head to the side. "I know my cousin told you about the pack losing its Luna," he said as I watched him. "So I'm sure you are aware that I have run this pack without a Luna for a few years now. But it's getting to a point where the pack needs a Luna, so it is becoming severely unstable. Why are you telling me all of this?" I asked, confused as I watched him sigh before running his hand through his hair. "Riley, your title," he said, looking at me. "Had you not been rejected, would have been Luna in your former pack. There aren't any other females among my pack that are made for the role of Luna in a pack. You are. It's who you were meant to be, and you know that. Since the start of our kind, there have only been a small handful of accounts where an alpha appointed the role of Luna to a female that wasn't his mate." "I don't understand," I said, shaking my head in confusion as I looked to him. "Riley, I would like for you to help me run this pack," he said. "To be my Luna, for all intents and purposes." I stared at him in shock. He wanted me, a former rogue, to help him run his pack. I don't care what my title would have been had I not been rejected. When his pack caught wind of him asking me to be his Luna of the pack, they'd turn against him. "Your E-pack would never accept me as their Luna," I said, shaking my head. "I've only been here for a week. Even still, some don't seem to like me as is. Your E-pack would turn against you the second you announce this to them all." "I don't think they would," he said, looking at me as he rested his elbows on his desk and folded his hands together as he watched me. "They all know I'm in need of a Luna or this pack will fall. Also a majority of them that have met you already sense the Luna in you. It's what you were meant to do. Just think about it, really. You're not required to give me an answer yet, but I do hope you'll think about it." I nodded and stood to my feet once he said I was allowed to leave, allowing me to go and be left to my thoughts about the new offer he had left with me. Chapter 5. He offered you that? Jen asked later that night, sitting in my room with me in the pack house after I had just told her what her cousin offered me hours before. "I don't care what my title would been, Jenna," I said, looking up at her as I sat on my bed. "His pack would turn against him. I'm a former rogue who he would love killed otherwise, but he let me wed and let me join. They won't accept me to be their Luna if I were to accept his offer." "Riley, think about it for a minute," Jenna said, walking over and kneeling in front of me where I sat as she took a hold of my hands. "You look hard enough, you can see that it's crumbling around the edges. I trust my cousin, and I know he wouldn't offer something as big as this if he didn't think it was for the good of the pack. Then I don't want his pack to hate him," I said, pulling my arms from her and standing up as I walked away from her with my back facing her. Your wolf wants you to accept it. Jenna asked after a few moments of silence. It was true. After Norman's offer, my wolf has been trying to get me to accept the offer to be Luna. Yeah, I whispered, not turning around to face her as I wrapped my arms around myself. Your e-wolf wants you to take your rightful place as Luna, she whispered, walking over to me. I can sense the Luna in you. Matt can too. Hell, even those kids today could. Why do you think they were so comfortable around you when you shifted into your wolf? It's who you are really, so you need to think about it. I kept my back to her as I felt her presence begin to leave the room before she stopped and spoke again. You told me when you first arrived that you didn't know your place in this pack. She said, maybe your place is by my cousin's side as the Luna. She didn't say another word as she exited out of my room and closed my door behind her. That was also true. On the first day I was here, when Jenna and I went to get me some clothes, I confided in her as I told her that because I hadn't been with a pack so long, I didn't know where my place would be to fit in here. I could almost feel my wolf nudging me to accept the offer. I know she wanted me too, but I couldn't just do that to Norman. I'd never forgive myself if his pack turned against him for giving the role of Luna to a rogue. Deciding that I needed to go for a run to clear my head, I got changed into a tank top and loose shorts before making my way out of my room and then out of the pack house itself. Going to the edge of the woods, I looked around to make sure no one was watching me before I stripped out of my shorts and tank so I could shift without ripping my clothes to shreds. Once shifted into my white wolf, I left my clothes behind a tree and took off at a run around the pack's territory and just enjoyed the feeling of being free. I lost track of time as I was running before coming across a scent that didn't belong to those of the pack. It smelled of blood and death. Turning my head quickly in the direction it seemed to be going, I realized it was heading straight for the center of the territory, where the pack house and the homes of the members of the pack were located. Just from the scent alone, I could tell it was more than one rogue. Way more, letting out a warning howl for the rest of the pack, knowing they'd hear it even if they were asleep. I quickly made my way following the scent that was leading me back. When I reached the edge of the woods, the sight before me had my wolf whimpering. Members of the pack were all fighting with the rogues, more than I figured there had been when I came across the trail. I hadn't had a chance to learn to fight. Norman had made plans for me to learn with Matt later on, but now was when I needed the knowledge most. Looking around panicked, not knowing what to do to help the pack out, I noticed that most of the children seemed to be hidden somewhere safe, as were some of the women. The only wolves really out fighting were the warriors and of course Norman. My wolf whimpered more when we spotted a tiny figure lying on the ground crying in the middle of all the fighting. It was when she looked up that I realized who it was. It was Abigail, and there was a black wolf with matted and blood-stained fur stalking its way towards her. Feeling my ears flatten on the back of my head and the hair on my neck stand straight up, I felt my wolf push me forwards and out of the woods with the sound of a vicious snarl leaving my lips as I bolted to them to place myself between Abigail and the threat, grabbing the wolf by the back of its neck and tossing it aside and away from Abigail. I quickly moved to place myself over her to keep her safe. I had my paws spread completely out to keep me balanced and my head was low. I felt my lips pull back over my canines as a growl erupted from my chest, showing I meant business. The rogue stood and shook his head, glancing back to me as my wolf took over completely. All that mattered was keeping this child safe. I'd risk my life before I'd let someone so young die at the hands of a rogue. As the rogue turned to fully face me and the girl once again, I felt another growl erupt from my chest as he stalked forwards, thinking he'd have a shot at getting to the girl behind me. I kept my eyes trained on the wolf in front of me. I may not have been trained, but I did know that much. Don't give them an opening to attack you. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rising more as this wolf continued to edge closer, threatening the life of the child behind me. Finally, when he thought I was least expecting it, the wolf lunged towards me and Abigail, but was only met by my wolf in the air, tumbling to the ground. The sounds of our snarls and growls could be heard as we bit and clawed at our opponent, trying to get the upper hand. I was able to get a couple of bites in on the wolf I was fighting, the taste of their irony blood in my mouth proving that. But it wasn't enough to subdue the threat before he managed to kick me off himself and pin me to the ground. In that second, I felt his teeth plunge into my shoulder, causing me to let out a howl of pain as he bit down harder. I managed to move around enough to get my feet under him just right before I kicked him off of me. I got back to my feet, favoring my right shoulder as I stood there, a shoulder he had bitten into. I could feel the blood pouring from the wound, my blood staining my white fur as my wolf whimpered out at the pain the injury was causing. Turning my head to look back at Abigail temporarily to make sure she was okay, I looked back when I heard the sound of movement from in front of me. I didn't have a chance to prepare for his attack this time like before. He went straight for my wounded shoulder and bit down hard on it once again. My leg gave out on me when he pulled away. I fell to the ground before he stood over me and snarled in victory. Although the wound didn't seem all that bad, I seemed to be losing too much blood as my vision began to blur and my head became dizzy. Just barely. I watched another black wolf leap over my fallen body and stand in front of me, pushing the rogue back away from me before standing in a defensive stance in front of me. This black wolf, larger than the rogue, was a member of the pack, and more importantly I could sense that it was Norman. I had never seen his wolf until that moment, and I was wishing that I waltzed on the verge of losing consciousness so that I could admire his wolf like I wanted to. My wolf whimpered out again from the pain in my shoulder as I watched Norman attack the rogue, successfully killing him just as I heard Dallas' voice. "Ms. Riley?" she called out before I felt her wrap her small arms around my large neck, the sounds of sobbing coming from her as Norman slowly turned around to face me. The last thing I saw before unconsciousness took over was worry clear in his blue eyes. When I came to again, I was in a pale white room that smelled of disinfectants with the annoying sound of a heart monitor. Groaning, I closed my eyes tightly from the blinding bright light that was in the room and reflecting off the walls, my head turning to the side in the process. Came a voice. "Really, can you hear me?" Slowly, I opened my eyes again, allowing them to adjust to the brightness of the room before looking around for the face that matched the voice. There were 3 people in the room with me, and Jenna was the one who had spoken. But my eyes went from her face to Norman's, where he stood against the wall with that same worried look in his eyes. "Thank God you're all right," I heard Jenna say before I felt her gently wrap her arms around me in a hug, careful of my now bandaged shoulder. "I don't think I was going to die from a bite on the shoulder, Jenna," I said, laughing lightly, trying to lighten the mood. She pulled back and gave me a playful glare while I just merely smiled innocently at her. "Don't ever scare me like that again, really," she said, grabbing my hand as she looked up to Matt beside her. I smiled at the 2 of them, happy they had found each other and neither had been rejected by a mate that was supposed to love and care for the rest of their life. "Matt," Norman said from where he stood near the wall, "would you and Jenna give me a few minutes to talk with Ms. Black? Besides you to have a baby you need to be getting home to." "Okay, Norman," Jenna said before looking back to me and squeezing my hand. "They'll come back and see you soon, really." Nodding, I watched as she and Matt left the room before my attention turned to Norman by the wall once more. I watched and waited for him to say something, but he remained quiet a little longer before he finally spoke up. "Are you all right, really?" he asked quietly. "It's just a bite on the shoulder," I said, looking down at my shoulder as I placed my hand on the wound gently. "It'll heal in no time." "Have you put any thought into the question I asked you in my office?" he asked after a couple minutes of silence. "I have," I said, nodding and looking down as I thought about how I'd answer him. "And what is your decision?" he asked as I looked back up to him, locking my brown eyes with his blue ones. "My wolf took over when that rogue was going for Abigail," I said, looking down again. "No matter what pack she's a part of, because she would leave in Aluna. She's protective over every wolf in the pack she's in. So in reality, I have no choice really on my decision. It's like it was already made for me the day I was born. I accept your offer to be your pack's Luna." Alpha Norman. Chapter 6. I watched as he stared at me in silence, maybe not sure I had really told him that, but I meant it. My wolf would forever be protective over any and every wolf that was in that pack. Snapping out of my thoughts, I looked back to Norman to see he was still staring at me. Stunned, it looked like. "Are you all right, Alpha?" I asked, smiling at him as he shook his head before actually looking at me again. "I'm fine, really," he said, smiling at me where I lay on the hospital bed. You made a wise decision. I hope you're right. I mumbled as I looked away. I still would hate myself if his pack turned against him for me doing this. Accepting his offer like I just did. Riley, he said, causing me to look back up at him. Most of the pack saw your actions today with protecting young Abigail from that rouge. They'll accept you because they know your intentions with becoming Luna would be to protect the pack. You don't have to worry about them leaving or turning against me for this. I just really hope you're right, Alpha, I said, looking up into his blue eyes as he smiled down at me. I am, he said. Now get some rest. We'll send Jenna in here to take you shopping when your shoulder completely heals so that you can go out and get a dress. A dress? I asked, looking at him as he stood to his feet. For what? I have to announce you to the pack officially as the new Luna, he said, looking at me from over by the door where he had walked to while he was talking. It's a formal event. I'm sure you're familiar with stuff like that from your old pack, Ms. Black. Jenna will help you find something to wear. He looked at me a moment longer before he turned and walked out of the room I was sitting in, leaving me to my thoughts. He was going to officially announce me as the new Luna to the pack, as soon as my shoulder was healed enough so that I could leave this room. It was strange they wanted to keep me in here until it was healed. I guess so I didn't move it wrong in the short amount of time it took to heal. The pack doctor came in about an hour later, telling me I should be good to leave by tomorrow morning, and until then I should just rest and relax. I was lying back on the bed, my eyes closed as I tried to fall asleep, when I heard a knock on my door. Yes, I called out as I lifted my head up to see two figures standing in the door. Someone wanted me to bring her by, Jenna said, her head popping in with a smaller head in front of her. Hey, Abigail, I said, smiling at the child in front of her as the girl's smile widened, and when I said hello to her. Ms. Really? Are you okay? She asked, looking up at me after running over to the side of my bed. Yes, sweetie, I'm fine, I said, smiling down at the child. You'll be better in no time. That mean old wolf will need to do better than just bite me on the shoulder. She smiled widely up at me as I turned my attention over to Jenna, who was now standing behind her. She just had to come and see you before I could put her to bed, Jenna said, placing her hand on top of Abigail's head. She wanted to thank you for earlier today. I turned my attention back to the small child as she smiled shyly at me now. Thank you for protecting me, Ms. Riley, she said as she placed her hands behind her back. You're very welcome, Abigail, I said. It's my job as an adult to help protect all the younger wolves in the pack. Speaking of your job, Jenna said, drawing my attention to her. I'm going to take Abigail here back to her room and put her to bed, then I'm coming here to have a word with you. Knowing exactly why she wanted to talk to me, I just nodded and waved as she led the girl out of the room before closing the door behind her. I laid my head back on the pillow again and just closed my eyes, waiting for when Jenna would come back after putting Abigail to bed so she could question me about what I know Norman told her. I knew she'd be happy, though. She wanted me to accept Norman's offer to be the pack's Luna, so I didn't have to worry about her biting my head off and calling me stupid for my decision. It wasn't long before I heard a knock at my door again. I knew it was Jenna this time, and she didn't wait for me to allow her entrance into the room before she opened the door and walked on in. So, she said as I peeked when I opened to look at her as she smiled. My cousin the Alpha told me that I'm to take you to find a dress to wear when you get out of here tomorrow. Now why would that be really? Why do you think, Jenna? I said, smiling widely at her as her own smile turned into a full-blown grin. You accepted his offer, didn't you? She asked. That would be why he wants me to take you out to get a special dress for this upcoming ceremony, isn't it? Yeah, I said, nodding and smiling. I won't officially become Luna until the ceremony, so I have a few days to rest up and prepare for it. You nervous about becoming Luna? She asked as she sat down on the edge of my bed and smiled at me. Is it that obvious? I asked as I peered up at her. No, not really, she said, shaking her head. But you'd be a fool if you weren't the least bit nervous about it. Even if you were truly my cousin's maid and just becoming Luna, you'd still have the right to be nervous. Why'd doesn't your cousin believe in second chance mates? I asked as I looked down to my hands resting on my lap. I think, she said after taking a moment. He feels that if there was such a thing as a second chance mate, he would have found her shortly after losing his mate and wife. But even then they say those don't show up that often. And from what I heard, the only way you can find them is if both sides have moved on from the loss or rejection of a mate they were originally supposed to be with. He hasn't moved on from her death, has he? I asked, looking up at her with sad eyes as she shook her head. He just can't let her go, she said sadly. She was the love of his life, and they so desperately wanted to start a family as soon as they were married. They tried so hard. The whole pack knew they were, but they just never managed to conceive before she was taken from us. "Dinner," I said after a few minutes, "if it's okay with you. Tomorrow before we go look for me a dress, I'd like to visit the Luna's grave and pay my respects to her." "I don't see what the harm of that could be," she said, smiling at me. "I think the pack would appreciate that you did that. Now get some rest in the morning so we can go." "Bye, Jenna," I said, smiling and waving as she stood and left the room, leaving me alone once again and hopefully for the rest of the night so I could rest and wrap my mind around me becoming the new Luna of this pack. I was once cast out by my own pack, labeled as a weakling, and forced to flee my former home. Yet fate has placed me in a new pack as their Luna. Chapter 7. I was pulling on the shirt and jeans Jenna had thoughtfully brought me earlier that morning. The doctor had just given me the all clear, declaring me fully healed with everything seemingly back to normal. The only lingering evidence of my injury was a slight soreness in my shoulder where the bite had been. Surprisingly, not even a scar remained from what should have been distinct teeth marks. As I finished dressing, Jenna Ray entered the room while I was slipping on the shoes she'd retrieved from my quarters. "Ready to go?" she inquired, her caring nature evident in her tone as she observed me rising to my feet. "Yep," I replied with a smile, which she warmly reciprocated. We exited the pack house, leaving behind the small hospital-like room where I'd been recovering. Jenna took the lead, guiding me towards what I assumed was the deceased Luna's final resting place. She had mentioned this morning, while delivering my clothes, that she'd escort me to the grave if I still wished to visit. Not far from the main pack house stood a majestic willow tree that had caught my eye on my second day here during my initial outing with Jenna. However, I hadn't ventured closer for a proper look until now. As we approached, I noticed a headstone nestled at the base of the tree, partially obscured by the cascading branches. "She was buried here?" I asked, turning to Jenna for confirmation. She nodded solemnly. "Yeah," she explained, her voice tinged with reverence. She adored this tree. It was the backdrop for so many significant moments between her and my cousin. Their first kiss, when he asked her out, and even his proposal all happened right here. This willow became their special place. She always said that if she fell victim to a rogue pack or met her end by other means, she wanted to be laid to rest here. At the foot of this tree, we had come to a halt a few paces from the willow. I glanced at Jenna, noticing her bowed head, before returning my gaze to the tree, taking another step towards the headstone that marked this sacred spot. I felt a profound sense of the love and history etched into this peaceful corner of the pack's territory. Kneeling down on the grass in front of the grave, I bowed my own head and sent up a silent prayer to the pack's lost Luna. I was praying that she'd help give me the strength and courage to help her mate run the pack like needed to be done. And then I just prayed that she was happy and watching down over Norman and keeping him safe like I knew she would be. I was so lost in thought after I sent up the end of my prayer, just thinking about what I was to do from here on out, that I didn't hear someone walking up behind Jenna and myself until they cleared their throat, jumping from being startled. I turned around quickly to look behind me, spotting Norman standing there next to Jenna, who was looking up at him. "Good morning, really," he said, nodding towards me before looking to Jenna. "Jenna, aren't you two going shopping today for that dress, really?" "Yes, sir," I said, nodding while still staying on my knees. "I asked Jenna to bring me to the Luna's grave this morning before we left. I wanted to pay my respects to her." and maybe ask her for some guidance on being a Luna of a pack. Well, you two had better be going, he said, nodding once. The ceremony will take place tonight just after dark. The pack has already been made aware of the ceremony, just not its purpose for having it. Yes, sir, I said again as I nodded before standing to my feet, brushing the bits of grass and dirt from my knees after standing. Looking to Jenna beside him, I watched as she nodded her head, signaling that it was time for us to go and do that shopping. I will see you tonight, really, he said as we walked off away from where he still stood by the Luna's grave, watching us as we left. We spent most of the day going from store to store in the local mall, just looking for something appropriate for me to wear tonight to the ceremony where HED announced me as the new Luna of the pack. As the hours drew closer to the time and Norman would start the ceremony, I became even more anxious, and I was grateful to Jenna for staying with me the whole day to keep me from freaking out and hiding somewhere. I guess after being rejected by my mate, who would have been an alpha, making me Luna by default. When I spent those years on my own, I just pushed the thought of ever being Luna from my head, and now it's freaking me out. But I told Norman I'd become Luna for his pack and help him run it. And I never go back on my word. An hour before the ceremony, Jenna began helping me get ready after returning from getting ready herself. We were going to keep things fairly simple makeup and hair-wise. I was someone who went all out for dressing up no matter what the occasion was. The dress itself was fairly simple. Just a red halter dress that stopped just above my knees and hugged my body enough to show any curves I had. I pair that with a pair of simple black stilettos that would probably put me at the same height as Norman when I stood next to him. The makeup we kept fairly neutral in color with the eyeshadow. The lipstick we made a little bolder to match the dress I was wearing. Everything else was kept light so it didn't draw too much attention to my face in general. My hair Jenna left down, adding some hairspray to it so that it stayed in place for the night. You look gorgeous, really, Jenna said, smiling at me as she looked into the mirror beside me after finishing with my makeup when I was fully dressed. I don't feel like myself, I said, smiling. This is the most dressed up I've ever been. Thank you, Jenna, for helping me. It's not a problem, she said, smiling at me. You're the new Luna after tonight. I'll do anything I can to help you out. Oh, before I forget, I bought this for you while you were trying on the dress earlier. I gave her a confused look as she held out a small black box to me. Taking it from her, I opened it to reveal a chain necklace. But on the chain was a pendant in the shape of a crescent moon. The pendant is white gold, she said as I looked up at her after opening it. I figured you should have something from a pack member to welcome you into the role of Luna. Thank you, Jenna, I said as I took the necklace out of the box before turning around and placing it around my neck. It looks good on you, Jenna said just as there was a knock on my door. Come in, I said as I fixed my hair back into place while looking in the mirror to see Norman appear in my doorway. He said, looking at me then at Jenna. Jenna, it's time. I'll head on to where everyone else is, Jenna said, nodding before smiling at me as she exited out of my room. You ready? Norman asked after Jenna was gone from the room. Just nervous, I said, nodding as I turned back to look at him after I was ready. You'll be fine, he said, smiling at me and holding his arm out for me to take his elbow. I hope so, I said, nodding, but I would be a fool if I was nervous. He nodded and remained silent as we made our way down the hall towards the others, like he was contemplating something. You look beautiful tonight, by the way, he said after a few moments. I looked up at him to see he was still looking straight ahead after saying that, but I could feel my cheeks heading up with a blush from the comment. Maybe I've been without male company too long. Or maybe I've begun to crush on him so they're joining his pack. Either way, I quickly turned my head back to look ahead to keep him from noticing the blush, taking a deep breath as we reached the open arch that led into the main den where everyone was gathering for this. I willed the blush to go away as Norman dropped my arm before bowing slightly to allow me to enter the room first. Every head turned towards our entrance, making me feel like they were criticizing me already and that didn't even know the reason for the ceremony tonight. Taking yet another deep breath, I looked over to Norman as he walked up to me before motioning to the front of the room. Shakily, I followed him to the front before standing off to the side as he called for everyone's attention. Now I haven't spoken a word about why we're gathering tonight. Norman said once the room got quiet as he looked around at all the faces. "But we are gathering for 2 reasons tonight. 1, Ms. Riley Black has yet to be properly introduced to the entire pack, and after her actions the other day with young Abigail and protecting her from the rogue, now would be the best time." I watched as the group murmured amongst themselves as he paused for a moment before calling back the order of the room. I could see Jenna and Matt standing among the crowd, smiling up at me. "Second," he said after the room quieted down once more, "you all know we've been without our Luna for several years now, and it's starting to affect our pack negatively. Now what I'm about to tell you was taken lightly, and some consideration was made before we decided to bring this forward to the pack itself. Riley Black, had she not been rejected by her mate, would have been Luna of her own pack. Now she did not agree to this right off, for fear that you all would turn against me. That alone shows she cares more for others than herself for power. But when she saved Abigail's life from the rogue and was injured herself, she proved to me as the alpha that she would look out for a pack before herself, whether she would have willingly agreed to this or not. I was going to make her the Luna of this pack." He took a moment, allowing the news to fully sink into what he had just said, while looking back to me and motioning for me to go stand beside him in front of everyone. Shakily, I walked over to stand by him as the murmurs began again and eyes turned towards me. I watched nervously as finally every eye was focused on me at the front of the room next to their alpha. Would they accept me as their new Luna after being a rogue? I didn't know, and that's probably what scared me the most. We stood there watching, as slowly, one by one, every head in the room bowed down in respect. I was stunned to say the least, but I was grateful they were so accepting of the matter. I looked over at Norman as he smiled back at me. "I told you they would be accepting of you as the new Luna, really," he said as I slowly returned his smile. "Go meet your new pack officially, and enjoy yourself tonight too. You are the guest of honor after all, Ms. Black." I smiled up at him and nodded before turning my attention back to the others as they had all lifted their heads up to peer at me. Taking a deep breath, I made my way into the crowd and greeted everyone, with Jenna and Matt by my side to help me out. Chapter 8. Norman said that he was going to slowly introduce me to the life of Luna, allow me to adjust to it instead of just throwing it all at me. Besides, he had to inform the council apparently that he had a new Luna for his pack, and he didn't want any misconceptions about why I was Luna when I lost his mate, or soon-to-be mate for that matter. The last thing we needed right now would be other alphas from around the states thinking that Norman had gotten himself the new mate after losing his to the rogue attack. The pack seemed welcoming enough of me being Luna. Even at the ceremony, everyone had warm smiles on their faces and was greeting me with warm welcomes. Every single person in the room had wished me good luck with the new task at hand from me, and those who had witnessed my acts of bravery and loyalty the night of that rogue attack where I had been injured told me that I'd do greatly as Luna. Just hope I could live up to their expectations and not let them down. Norman told me this morning, after I met him up at his office for my first day on the job as Luna, that in about a week's time, we would be heading to a neighboring pack's land to join in a meeting amongst their other allies to discuss the sudden increase of rogue activity in the area. Nodding my understanding, he told me I was free to go and that if he needed me for anything he'd call for me. As I exited out of the pack house, I was greeted with "Good morning, Luna" or "Hello, Luna" from any passing pack member. It was going to take some major getting used to, but I knew I could handle it. I smiled as I spied Jen sitting open field that the pack made their homes in as she was surrounded by most of the children of the pack. My smile only grew when I spotted little Abigail running around with some of the other children her age, being very quiet. I smirked as I made my way soundlessly towards Jenna where she sat. But I didn't get to sneak up on her before the children spotted me and spoiled my fun. "Good morning, Ms. Luna." A couple of the children chimed in right when I was behind Jenna, causing her to spin around to face me while I sent playful little glares to the kids. "Good morning, everyone," I said, smiling as I took a seat next to Jenna. "Ms. Riley?" Abigail screamed, smiling as she ran over to me before stopping right in front of Jenna and me as she realized what she said. "I mean Ms. Luna. You can still call me Ms. Riley," I said, smiling as I opened my arms for her. She grinned widely at me as she launched herself into my arms, hers wrapped tightly around my neck in a hug. I started laughing as I looked over to Jenna as she smiled back at me while the other children went back to playing their games before I came around. "Morning, really," she said, smiling as Abigail finally let go and ran off to join her friends. "Hey, Jenna," I said before looking out at all the children. "Is this like your job or something? Looking after the children of the pack?" "Kind of," she said. "I just enjoy being around them. Normally I'm only watching Abigail, but then the others always come and join us. I never send them away, so I end up with most of the children before noon." "Why just Abigail?" I asked curiously as I turned my attention away from the playing kids and over to her and lowered. "Abigail is an orphan," she said sadly. "Her mom and dad were warriors in our pack. They died when we had that rogue attack. The same one that took Norman's mate. She was just a baby. Barely a year." "That's horrible," I said, looking back to the little girl as she continued to smile happily and play. "She asks me every day when her parents will be coming back for her," Jenna said as I heard her voice begin to break. "And every day I have to come up with something to say. I mean, how do you tell a 5-year-old that her mother and father aren't coming back?" I looked over at Jenna again before leaning over and wrapped arms around her shoulders as she began to cry. I didn't know what to say. I was the best at comforting people like this. After all, I was 4 years out of practice for this kind of thing. So we just sat there, her leaning on my shoulder as we watched the kids play and slowly dwindle down in numbers as their parents came to get them for lunch. When it was just us and Abigail left, I stood to my feet, looking down at a confused Jenna. I smiled before turning my attention over to Abigail. "Hey, Abigail," I called out. "Let's go get you something to eat." I smiled as she beamed up at me before running over and grabbing my outstretched hand that I was offering to her. I smiled down at Jenna and nodded for her to follow us as I led the way towards the pack house. I hated that she didn't know who her mother and father were, but I hoped that when she was older then Jenna would tell her all about her parents so that she knew how great they were because they risked their lives for their pack. As we entered the house, I smiled at all the couples of young teen wolves, all who had just found their own mates and were enjoying time together. "You'll find someone again," Jenna said, resting a hand on my shoulder, letting me know that I had stopped without realizing. Continuing on, we didn't stop again until we were in the kitchen. "Okay, Abigail," I said, smiling as I knelt down in front of her while Jenna took a seat on the other side of the island bar in the center of the kitchen. "What would you like for lunch?" "Can I have a grilled cheese sandwich?" she asked, peering up at me with big eyes. "Please, Ms. Riley." "Of course you can," I said, smiling before straightening up and getting everything I needed from the refrigerator. While I allowed the pan to heat up and the butter to melt, I began putting the sandwich together before I felt little hands grab onto my leg like she was hiding from something. Confused, I looked down at Abigail to see she was staring towards the door. Quickly, I turned my attention to the door to see that she was staring at none other than Norman, relaxing when I realized there was no threat. I smiled at him before turning my attention back to Abigail's food. "Anything I can help you with?" I asked politely, keeping my eyes on the pan in front of me as I signaled to Norman that I knew he was there. "Just checking in on how you're settling in," he said as I heard his footsteps enter into the kitchen while feeling Abigail tighten her hold on my leg. "I'm settling fine, thank you," I said before reaching down with one hand and patting Abigail's head in hopes of calming down her shyness towards the alpha. "You haven't shifted since the Rouge attack," Norman said after a few minutes. "I'm going for a run in a bit, to stretch and give my wolf a chance to be in control. Would you like to join me, really?" I looked over at him before looking back to Jenna in front of me as she nodded quickly. "Sure, that'd be great," I said, smiling back at him. "Just let me finish fixing little Abigail here her lunch." "No, you go," Jenna said, jumping up and walking over to me. "You'll finish her lunch. You go and stretch that shoulder of yours. You deserve it." "You sure?" I asked, looking at her as she smiled widely at me. "Completely," she said. "Go and enjoy." "Really? I've got this. Thank you," I said, smiling at her before giving her one of those awkward sigh hugs you get when you can't exactly face the person to hug them like normal. I bent down to Abigail's height to give her a hug before I straightened back up and followed Norman out of the kitchen, then out of the pack house. We walked to the edge of the clearing where we each went in separate directions so we could strip down out of our clothes and transform into our wolves. When I was fully transformed, I met with him back near the edge of the clearing and finally got to take in his impressive wolf. I only remembered vaguely when I first got to see him in his wolf form, when he had protected me from that rogue that I had been protecting Abigail from. But now that I was fighting with myself to stay conscious, I was taking in every detail about his wolf, and I didn't even care if I was staring when I shouldn't be. Obviously, being of alpha blood and being the alpha of this pack, he was much bigger than my wolf or the others I had seen the day of the attack. His fur was as black as the midnight sky without the light of the moon or stars. And his eyes. Even in his wolf form, his eyes were the same blue as they were in his human form. I had to shake the feelings for him I was beginning to develop, knowing that there was no way there'd be anything more here than me being a part of his pack and eventually a good friend of his. But these feelings began to build after he saved my life. I tried to reason with my heart that he didn't save me because he cared about me like that, but because I was a member of his pack now, and it was an alpha's duty to protect all members of the pack. But still, it didn't help with the compliment he had given me just before we joined the others for the ceremony in which he announced my new title to the rest of his pack. If anything, it made my feelings stronger for him. I hadn't even told Jenna about these feelings boiling inside my heart. I couldn't tell her, fearing she'd tell him, and that was the last thing I wanted her to do. Mentally shaking myself and focusing on the here and now, I looked to Norman to see he was nodding his head for me to follow him just before he took off in a run. I was able to keep up with him easily, but I kept my pace where I let him lead the way. I more or less enjoyed just following him anyway. I wasn't in the mood for any sort of playful racing with anyone. But even still, while enjoying myself, my thoughts still went back to Norman and him losing his mate before she could give him a child like they so desperately had tried for so many years it would seem. But fate had dealt him a cruel hand. Dealt me one too, with being rejected by the one I was supposed to be loved and cherished by. Even after everything that had happened to me, you'd think I'd give up on the whole idea of love. But I still looked forward to the day when I could meet someone who'd care for me like my mate should have. But even then, that thought turned dark itself. If I did find someone to spend the rest of my time with like I would like on with a mate, I'd have to give up my position as Luna to Norman's pack, knowing how possessive male wolves can be over a mate, whether natural or chosen. I wouldn't be able to continue on as Norman's Luna for fear I'd start a fight between him and who I could end up with eventually. That thought kind of saddened me, to know that I had finally found my place in this pack, only to have to give it up again. We had come to a stop by now, though, interrupting my depressing thought process thankfully, in another but smaller clearing in the pack's territory. Looking back over to Norman as he stared up towards the tops of the trees, like he was watching the smaller animals move around up there. I could help but wonder what it'd be like if my feelings for him wouldn't be so one-sided and him actually want me around for more than just his Luna for the pack. But then again, so why would he even bother looking for another mate at all? Chapter 9. When Norman and myself got back to the pack house after our little run, he went back up to his office to get back to pack duties while I went and found Abigail and Jenna still in the kitchen. Abigail just finishing up her lunch. "You're back." She beamed at me as she moved away from her plate and ran towards where I stopped in the doorway to the kitchen. "Enjoy your run," Jenna asked from behind Abigail as I bent to pick the 5-year-old up. It was all right, I said, shrugging as I turned my attention back to the little girl in my arms. "Now, Abigail, what was that earlier when he came into the room? Does he scare you or something?" I watched as she looked up at me and shook her head before seeming to think of her response. "Hes just so big," she whispered out before we both turned to the sound of Jenna's laughter. "Yes, weedy hes big all right," she said, trying to catch her breath. "But hes a big teddy bear. He wouldn't hurt you, Abigail. I've told you that several times." "I know," she said, looking down as her arms wrapped themselves around my neck. "Tell you what," I said, smiling at her as I readjusted her in my arms. "Me and you can both get used to him together. What do you say, Abigail?" "Okay, Miss Riley." she said, smiling up at me as she hugged me tightly. I smiled and glanced over at Jenna from over Abigail's shoulder to see she was smiling at me. Why don't we go back outside? She spoke up after a few minutes and causing Abigail to look over at her. I'm sure the others are back from eating their own lunches by now. Okay, Abigail said as I sat her down on her feet before she took off running for the door. I smiled and waved to Jenna, deciding to opt out for this time and just go to my room to relax after that run. The rest of the week before that meeting Norman mentioned that was coming up I spent getting more accustomed to the life of being a Pax Luna. I even moved rooms to one on the top floor where it's custom for the Pax Alpha, Luna, and their children to be. I argued about it, saying I didn't want a room there when under normal circumstances it's only for the Alpha, his mate and their kids. In the end, I lost out on that battle, but at least they gave me a room with a great view of the water that was near the pack house. And it's on the east side so I get a great view of the sun every the water's her eyes and every morning. So I guess I'm not to upset them that they made me move rooms after getting the title of Luna. It did have its perks. My room even had a small balcony too, so I'll be sure to use that if I ever wake up early enough in the mornings to watch the sunrise. I woke up early the morning when Norman and I would be leaving to head to that neighboring Pax territory to discuss those rogues with them. I remembered the night before when Jenna told Abigail I'd be gone for a few days to help Norman with some things. Abigail was not too pleased. That whole afternoon after Jenna told her, she just pitched a fit about how I was abandoning her like her parents did. Oh, if she only knew what happened with them, she wouldn't have compared my leaving to that. I remember telling her it was just a couple days and I'd be back and we could do whatever she wanted to until she was satisfied that I wasn't going anywhere. It broke my heart actually, seeing her like that and believing she was being abandoned again. In that short amount of time, I've become attached to that little girl. Clearing my mind as I stood from my bed in nothing but a white tank top and a pair of gray cotton shorts, I walked over to the balcony door and opened it before stepping out onto it as I stared out at the horizon as I waited for the sun to come up. As I waited, I pulled my hair back into a bun and randomly skimmed the beach before noticing a figure moving around in the dark. Putting my hands on the railing to the balcony after finishing with my hair, I leaned forward slightly while squinting to see just who it was walking around on the beach below. Quickly moving back inside and shutting the balcony door, I slipped on a black off-the-shoulder sweater with 3 howling wolves. Yes, I know, ironic, isn't it? And a full moon before slipping on a pair of black flats and making my way out of the room. I quietly made my way down the stairs to keep from waking anyone who may be sleeping still at this early hour of the morning. Shutting the door to the house behind me softly, I made my way around the pack house towards the water with my arms wrapped around me as it seemed just a little cool this morning. But nothing too bad with our seemingly built and werewolf heater in our DNA. Thoughting Norman after I cleared the house and the water was in full view. I made my way over to him and waited till I was closer before I spoke up to let him know I was out there with him. Good morning, I said when I came to a stop just a few feet from him and his back was still turned to me. All I could see so far was that he was in a black overcoat, blue jeans, and was barefoot. Good morning, he said, glancing over his shoulder at me with a small smile. What are you doing up so early? I couldn't sleep anymore, I said as I glanced around him at the water and the slowly rising sun that was beginning to paint the sky a light shade of pink. And I could ask you the same thing. Old habit, he said as he turned his attention back to the horizon. I used to come out here every morning with my wife before she was taken from me. I'm sorry, I whispered as I walked forwards a couple steps and placed my hand lightly on his shoulder. When I was standing beside him, my hand still lightly resting on his shoulder, I caught a glimpse of him, in fact shirtless under that coat he was wearing. Looking away, hoping he didn't see the forming blush that was taking its place on my cheeks, I looked back towards the horizon to watch the sun in silence with him. You know, I whispered as I kept my eyes on the sunrise. After Jenna told me about what happened to your mate, she told me you didn't believe in those second-chance mates, if there was truly such a thing. He said, then I would've found my own by now. They're just little fairy tales for young children who are infatuated with the idea of love. I don't think you truly believe what you say, I said, looking over at him with a frown. I think the reason why you haven't found yours yet if they do exist, is because you haven't completely let go and moved on from your mate. You think you know everything, don't you? He snarled at me, but I didn't back down. I was going to show fear to him when I hadn't shown another man fear since I ran away from my old pack after being rejected by my own mate and then beaten too. I don't think I know everything, I said, shaking my head. But I do know you haven't moved on from her, and that's why you haven't found that second mate. I'm not saying you should completely forget about her, but just let her go so she can rest in peace. I know she's watching over you and wanting for you to do just that. And what about you? He asked as he turned his attention on me completely. Have you moved on from that rejection you received? I've moved on enough where it only causes me pain to remember it, I said, but it hasn't stopped me from looking for a second chance at the love I was supposed to have the first time. He looked away from me and I groaned out. Why do men have to be so stubborn? Look fine, I said, grabbing his arm and causing him to look at him. Stay hung up on your dead mate. Your pack will die out after you're gone when you don't have an heir to take over. Look, I get it. She was your first love and shit. And it's a real bitch that she died. But you're slowly killing the future of your pack while holding on to her. Keep her memory, but don't hold on to it so tightly that you can't move on for the better of your pack. I looked up into his blue eyes as I spoke, my brown ones going back and forth between his, before I let go of his arm and turned to walk away with a sigh. I was trying to tell him how to run his pack or anything like that. After all, it's none of my business. But I'm trying to make him see what he's doing isn't healthy. I made it a couple of steps before I felt something firmly grab my arm and spin me around. I looked up to speak, but no words were able to pass through my lips as another pair were placed roughly on them as I collided with a solid surface, stunned with my hands flat against the chest I was pressed up against. My eyes shot wide open allowed me to see that it was Norman's lips that were on mine. Faintly, I could feel the telltale signs of sparks as my eyes slowly fluttered closed. Those sparks were faint, but they were there all the same as my arm slowly rose up to circle around his neck while the firm grip he had on my arm went away as his own arm circled my waist and pulled me closer to his body. Finally being able to pull away, my eyes opened as I looked up at him as I blinked and tried to figure out what had just happened. I pulled back away from him, but kept my arms around his neck while his own stayed into their place around my waist. I opened my mouth to say something, but just ended up closing it again when nothing would come out. So instead, I just stared up at him and waited to see if he'd speak up first for me. You're right, he finally whispered as he peered down at me. I had been holding on to her for too long. I was just too blinded by grief to truly see that. And it took someone else to tell me that I needed to open my eyes and see just what was in front of me now. I felt a blush rising to my cheeks as I smiled up at him before pulling away from his grasp completely. We should, I said, clearing my throat. We should probably go get ready to leave. And with that I walked off back to the house, but not before turning back to glance at him one last time with a smile on my face. Chapter 10. The ride to the other pack's territory was a long and awkward one after what happened this morning between Norman and me. Jenna knew something was up when she walked down the stairs with me as we were packing up one of the cars to leave, but she couldn't get a word out of me. It's not like I'd willingly tell her that I kissed her cousin this morning before the rest of the pack was awake. On the beach, at sunrise no less. Norman told me as we were heading back upstairs to get dressed for our trip to the other pack that I wouldn't need to wear anything fancy. So I chose to wear a simple and plain white shirt and some baggy jeans that still fit just right that I bought with Jenna. Norman himself was in a simple shirt and jeans, so I knew it'd be okay, at least if he was dressed the same way as me. I had my hands clasped together in my lap as I stared out the window and watched the trees pass us by as we drove on. My mind kept replaying what happened this morning, the talking, my little rant to him about letting go, and then finally the kiss. Bearing a glance over at him, I looked to Norman as he drove us closer to our destination, his right hand on the steering wheel as he seemed to be chewing on his left thumbnail, a habit I picked up that he did whenever deep in thought. Jenna told me Abigail was so happy knowing you were leaving with me for a few days, Norman said finally, snapping my attention from my thoughts. She compared my leaving to her parents, I said, looking down at my lap. She thought I was abandoning her, that they had abandoned her when she was just a little baby. "You know you're not," he said as I looked over at him to see him glance at me before turning his attention back to the road. "And when she's old enough to really understand what happened, someone will tell her what really happened to her mom and dad." "Who will tell her?" I asked, looking over at him, waiting for his answer. "Either Jenna," he said, sparing me another glance, "or if she's adopted in the future, then whoever adopts her can tell her. I promise you shall know the truth about her family when she's old enough." "Why hasn't anyone adopted her yet then?" I asked. "She's 5 years old. I've tried finding her a home with some of the members of my pack," he said, letting out a sigh. "But no one wants a kid when they're either trying for their own or already have enough to take care of. Then others just don't want one, period. Then I'll take her," I said, looking over at him determinedly. "Give me my own place and I will. I'll raise her myself. It's not like I have a mate who wants kids with me as we speak." I watched him glance over at me again before looking away and letting out a sigh. "You are the Luna of the pack now," he said, "and your place is the pack house. And while you are Luna, that's where you have to stay. I'm sorry, really." I sighed in defeat and laid my head back against the headrest in the car, closing my eyes. "How much further until we're there?" I asked, not even opening my eyes to look over at him. He said, "Just a few more minutes. And really, I'm sorry you had to be dragged away from Abigail like this. I know you've gotten attached to her. If you're serious about wanting to take care of her full time, then I'll see to it that you get to." I smiled over at him before I felt the car come to a stop and he cut the engine. Looking ahead of me, my smile dropped when I realized where it was that I was now at. I looked up at the all-too-familiar pack house before me. All the memories I had managed to suppress in the last 4 years were all coming back to me now in a tidal wave. "Riley, of a witch, Riley," I heard Norman's voice say. "Is there something wrong? Whatever happens while we're here?" I whispered out as I continued to stare out at the house before us. "Just let it go, okay?" "Riley, what are you talking about?" Norman asked as I broke my attention away from the pack house and turned to look at him. "You'll see soon enough," I whispered as I turned and climbed out of his car, going to the popped trunk to get my bag from back there. I slipped the strap to my bag onto my shoulder as I stood by the back of the car, waiting for Norman to get his stuff and lead the way inside while I just simply stared at my old personal hell. "Are you going to explain to me what's wrong?" he asked after a few seconds, as we walked up to the steps with him right beside me. "It's nothing," I said, shaking my head, not wanting to actually tell him what was bothering me because he'd find out soon enough. "That's bullshit, really," he said, and I could hear the anger in his voice because I was keeping something from him. "You were smiles just moments ago, but that changed when we got here. Now why is that?" "You'll see soon enough," I said, peering at him from the corner of my eye, and waited for him to knock on the door for us to be greeted. At the sound of the door being opened, I lowered my head with my eyes to the floor as I waited for the first wave of recognition to begin with whoever was greeting us. "My God," I heard a familiar female voice say seconds after the door opened. "Is that you?" Slowly, I lifted up my eyes to see one of the girls I had originally called a friend standing there. I had been friends with everyone in the pack back then before I found my... I had even been friends with him. But then everything changed when we found out. The person standing in front of me had been his girlfriend at the time, and the two had been so sure they'd end up being mates. But then I became his mate and all my friendships just disappeared. Then began the abuse I put up with while I was still here before I ran. "Jessica," I said, nodding my head once before I looked over to Norman out of the corner of my eye. He had this clearly confused look on his face. She said before shaking herself from her thoughts. "Come on in. The meeting is in the dining hall." Norman nodded once and walked in with me right behind him before Jessica closed the door after us. "Follow me," she said before walking around and leading us down the still familiar hallway that I hadn't set foot in for over 4 years now. "Really, how have you been?" "It's been what?" "For years now since I last saw you here." "Something like that," I said, keeping my eyes away from her or my surroundings and just staring at the floor as I felt Norman's eyes on me. She didn't say anything more before we reached the closed doors to the dining hall, which she then pushed open. "Babe," she said, walking in with Norman and me following behind her. "Alpha Norman is here." And guess who showed up with him? We had come to a stop just inside the doorway. Norman standing slightly in front of me as I slowly lifted my eyes to peer ahead of me at the front of the table where he sat. "Alpha, it's always a pleasure to see you," he said before he turned his eyes to me. "My, if it isn't really. I didn't expect to see you again after you turned tail and ran. Going rouge. Figured you would have been dead by now with how weak you were." My body stiffened the second he said my name. But beside me, with the way he was talking to and about me, I could feel Norman stiffening as well. "Alpha Blake, if I may," Norman said after a moment with a clipped tone. "How do you know, really? She didn't tell you?" he asked, looking from Norman then to me and back to him. Surely she would have said something the second she saw this play. Norman stared at him while I took a single step back, closer to the door so I could make a run for it if I needed to. "No," Blake asked before laughing and shaking his head. "You see, really is my mate. Or rather, she was my mate before I rejected her weakling ass. My father would have torn me limb from limb if I would accepted such a weak mate into our family. Once she was gone, I accepted my Jessica as my mate and rightful Luna of my pack. I was over him. I wasn't going to allow his words to hurt me and show weakness in front of him anymore. I wasn't a part of his pack anymore. I was a part of Norman's, and I was Luna of Norman's pack. I had my place now, and it wasn't with that jackass in front of me. She's far from weak," Norman said, causing me to peer over at him. "If she were weak, then I would have never made her Luna of my own pack." I quickly turned my attention to Blake, watching as he seemed stunned, speechless, and seemed pale from Norman's words. After all, Norman was older and had more experience. I'm sure even Blake felt intimidated by him right now. My own pack wouldn't allow for a weak Luna if she hadn't proven herself beforehand. He continued on, and not giving him a chance to say something, with no training in combat at all, really stepped up and protected one of the children from a rouge and getting injured in the process. She stayed on her feet until she was sure that child would be safe. I don't know of any weak wolf that could have done that. So before you start saying someone is weak, make sure you know before. I stared over at Norman, my mouth slightly open as I watched him try to keep calm as what Blake had said about me obviously some strange reason. The adrenaline kept her on her feet. Blake said as Norman went to turn away. That's all it was. In a flash, before I even had time to realize what the hell had happened, Norman punched Blake hard enough to send him to the floor before lifting him back up by the collar of his shirt and holding him at level. "Say one more thing about my Luna, and I won't hesitate to kill you," he said, glaring at Blake. "Fight your rouge problem on your own." With that, he dropped Blake to the ground, where Jessica quickly ran to his side, while Norman turned around and headed back towards me and his dropped bag by my feet. I stared slack-jawed at him as he grabbed his bag before turning and walking by me. "Come on, really, let's go home," he said. Okay. I followed a smile as I quickly followed after him, not even sparing a final glance at the whimpering man who would have been my mate. Chapter 11. We pulled up to our pack house in silence, Norman still looking very upset and tense over what had happened hours earlier back at my old pack. I knew he was probably upset with me for not telling him about that being my old pack, but he would have found out whether I told him or not, obviously. But after punching my ex-mate and telling me to follow him that we were going home, Norman hasn't spoken a word to me since. It was late evening by the time we got into and pulled up to the garage for the pack house. Still in silence, we climbed out of the car and grabbed our bags before heading inside, with Norman leading the way, and I was just wondering if he'd end up telling the pack about what happened back there and why we're back earlier than need be. And as we were walking by the open archway that led into the living room, heads turned towards us before we were met with Jenna and Matt. Matt was next to Norman while Jenna was by me and giving me a curious look as she looked back and forth between me and her older cousin. "Matt, begin training with really first thing in the morning," Norman said, not even glancing at any of us near him. "What?" Matt asked with confusion lacing his voice. "Why? Are we helping the other pack with their rogue problem?" "Just do it, Matt," Norman said before walking around him and up the stairs, leaving me, Matt, and Jenna with Matt giving me one hell of a confused look. I just simply shook my head before walking around him as well and heading up the stairs to where my room was now located. I hadn't been in my room long, barely even begun unpacking my things, when there was a knock on the door and the sound of it opening before I could say. I looked back over my shoulder, my back to the door in the first place, to see that it was Jenna who came to visit me. Bridie, what's going on? Jenna asked as she closed my room door back and looked at me almost worriedly. Nothing, I said, shaking my head and looking back to my bag on my bed. That's bullshit, really, she said as she walked forward and grabbed my arm and caused me to look at her again. What happened while you were both gone? I sighed as I looked away from her, looking back to my bag but not making a move to finish unpacking as I just stood there staring at it. The pack we were going to help was my former pack, I whispered out finally. Norman and Mike's mate got into it, and before we left, Norman told him to fight the rogues on his own. What happened between the two of them? She asked, finally letting go of my arm and allowing me to turn and look at her. My ex-mate said a few choice and colorful things about me, I said, lowering my head before looking up at her with just my eyes. Norman didn't like what he said, defended me even, and then punched him before anyone realized what was happening. But Jenna, what I don't understand on the matter is, he looked so damn protective when he defended me, and not the protective that you'd expect with an alpha protecting one of his pack members either. Jenna, you mean, she started but stopped as she just stared at me. In his eyes, I said, looking at her as I sat down on my bed. I saw the same protectiveness I see whenever I looked at you and Matt. The same protectiveness that's in Matt's eyes all of the time. The protectiveness that come on instinct for any wolf that wants to keep what's theirs safe. Maybe his wolf is starting to move on now from his mate that's passed, Jenna said, smiling with a hopeful gleam in her eyes. Her saying that brought back memories from earlier this morning just before Norman and I left. Memories from when Norman and I talked on the beach and then him kissing me before I could walk away to give him some space after my rant about not moving on in the first place. Jenna must have caught on to my silence, because she placed her hands on her hips and sent me a glare. Okay, really now, what aren't you telling me? She said as I looked up and over at her with my eyes only as I felt my cheeks heating. I said, looking away. Well, you see, this morning I had a chat with Norman before we left for the other pack. Okay, she said, motioning for me to continue on. Well, I said, tilting my head slightly. I kind of ranted to him on the beach at sunrise about him not moving on from his mate after her death and said he was in a sense killing his pack because of it. And he kissed me before I could walk away. What? I heard Jenna squeal before she jumped me and wrapped her arms around me in a tight hug. Well, I wasn't expecting that for a reaction, I said, laughing as she finally pulled back before sitting down on my bed beside. Is that what had you preoccupied this morning when you two were leaving? She asked as I blushed a darker shade of red than I already was before, nodding. Really, why didn't you tell me? Because your cousin is like twice my age, I said, looking at her. And I didn't think it meant anything anyway. I thought I had just pushed him or his wolf too much and it sort of happened. Riley, if he or his wolf was being all protective over you back at your old pack with your dumb sex mate, she said, smiling at me, then it most definitely meant something. It's just him not sure how Norman feels about this, or if he even understands what the hell happened. Yeah, I said, nodding with a sigh. I could see in his body language back in the car on the way home and then downstairs that he didn't understand what the hell had got into him. I mean, you said so yourself that he doesn't believe in the second chance mate that some wolves are lucky to get. Hell, he even told me that on the beach before my rant. That's why I'm not going to say anything, nor bring up what happened. But let him figure it out, and then he can come to me if he wants to, but I'd understand if he didn't. You can't force him, and it'd be a damned fool if I tired. I watched as she nodded, seeming deep in thought before her eyes looked back to me. I guess that's why he wants Matt to start training you to fight now, she said. He might be worried that your ex-mate will try and start something after what happened today. Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me, I said, shaking my head as I stood to my feet before turning back around to unpack my bag again. I knew Black all my life. He was all about power and strength. Helly called me weak in front of Norman, and I think that's what caused Norman to go all protective alpha, at least on him. Norman just basically challenged Blake. And Blake will step up and accept that challenge, probably being the first one to make a move. It won't surprise me if we get attacked by my former pack in the coming weeks. Well then, Jenna said as she stood to her feet. Guess we better get started on your training first thing in the morning then, like my cousin said. Believe so you can finish unpacking then head to bed. I know it's been a long day for you. I smiled and nodded as she reached to hug me before she exited out of my room and leaving me to finish what I was doing. I unpacked all my things that had been taken with us when we figured we'd be gone for a few days before I headed to the build-in bathroom to get cleaned up and to allow myself a chance to relax after all the stress and traveling done today. I took a quick shower, knowing I'd need my rest tonight in order to prepare myself for tomorrow morning when I would begin my training with Matt. I think without really realizing it, Norman showed he really wanted to keep me protected, and more than just because I was the Luna for his pack. And whether he realizes that or not, his protectiveness towards me after today's events is going much farther than just the Dagius and Alpha and looking to protect one of his own. Chapter 12. It's been nearly a week since Norman and I returned from my former pack. HES kept to himself in his office and only called for me when he needed me to do something for him. Every time I look at him, I can see in his eyes that HES having an inward battle with his emotions about what's going on. Everything from him actually kissing me the morning before we left for my old pack to his overprotectiveness of a pack member at my former pack where I was apparently disrespected in his eyes. And I guess I was. I've been training with Matt and the other warriors daily, getting ready in case there is a fight between packs approaching. The only ones who know about this are Norman, Matt, Jenna, the other warriors, and me. We've chosen to keep this just amongst ourselves to keep the pack from panicking. It was early morning. The sun was already visible in the sky and some of the other warriors were out practicing as well. Matt and I were doing a quick morning warm-up of jogging around the territory perimeter before we moved on to practicing our moves again. He praises my efforts every day, saying I'm improving each session and that before long it'll be just as good as the other warriors. As we make our way back around to the front of the territory, coming to a stop in front of the pack house, I spot Norman standing there waiting for our return. I was wondering if I might spar with Riley this morning. Norman said, looking to Matt before he glanced to me. Of course, sir. Matt said, bowing his head slightly before backing off and running to join the other warriors where they were practicing at. I watched as Matt disappeared before I turned my attention back to Norman. So where are we going? I asked, smiling as he looked at me before motioning with his hand for me to follow him. Matt's been training you fight tactics. He said, I now want to see if we can't improve your speed a bit with them. How would you do that? I asked curiously as I followed him around the house to the back where the ocean was located behind it. Like this, he said as he ran towards the water, pulling his shirt off as we went and leaving me to stare at his naked back, shaking away any thoughts I was having. I quickly dashed into the water after him in just my shorts and sports bra, stopping when we came up about waist deep in the water. I let my palms glide across the top of the water for a moment before I looked back to Norman, waiting for his instructions. But instead of any verbal instructions, Norman chose to lunge at me to try and catch me off guard. It worked for a second before I managed to dodge him, moving out of the way before he could knock me back into the water, turning around so I could face him after I moved. I pulled my brown hair back into a bun to keep the wet locks out of my face while Norman smiled at me, this mischievous glint in his baby blue eyes as he waited for me to signal I was ready for his next advancement. But before I decided to tell him I was ready, I quickly splashed him with a mini tidal wave of water and instantly started laughing when he appeared before me soaked. When he peered at me, his long wet brown hair falling in his face as he regarded me with what I was hoping was a playful glare, I realized I was in deep trouble. The second he moved towards me, I squealed out with a smile on my face and turned to run for the beach where I knew I could move a hair faster than I was now. Making my way to the beach, I got my feet in the sand and running faster, but I was nearly fast enough to outrun the Alpha. Before I was even halfway near the edge of the sand for the beach, I was shoved to the ground by something large and heavy. Norman. I started laughing between gasps of breath as Norman rolled me over onto my back, allowing me to peer up at him as his figure loomed over me. My hands were on either side of my head, his holding on to my wrists as he stared down at me with water dripping down from his hair and body to land everywhere along mine. My chest was heaving, as was his, as his blue eyes peered down at me and moved from my eyes to my lips, then right back up to my eyes. It was like the world turned into slow motion as he slowly lowered his head towards mine, his eyes darting back down to my lips just before he made contact with them. I turned my head to the side slightly, watching as his eyes closed before I closed my own, savoring the kiss. His hands, still continuing to hold mine by my head, moved to where he was holding my hands instead as our fingers intertwined together. As the kiss continues, I felt his tongue swipe slowly across my bottom lip, asking for entrance into my mouth, without a second thought or a moment's hesitation. I opened my mouth for him and granted him entrance while enjoying the feel of his tongue moving around inside my mouth. As his tongue roamed around inside, his hands tightened their grip on mine, almost like he didn't want to let go. But in the end, our kiss was brought to a sudden close by someone clearing their throat. In a matter of seconds, I felt Norman's body move away from mine as I used my now free left hand to cover my mouth, then look away from the person who had interrupted the kiss. Turned make out session as I felt my cheeks flooding with heat. Enjoy making out with my older cousin. I heard Jenna's voice from my left and I was sure if I looked over at her, she'd have this huge grin on her face. He kissed me, I said with a hoarse voice before glancing over at where she stood, hands on her hips and this smile on her face. I'm sure he did, she said, grinning before turning her back and walking away from where I still laid in the sand. I went straight inside after Jenna left, straight to my room and stayed there until the next day. It took me that long to just get my emotions under control after that kiss from Norman. It blew my mind, to put it simply. He had acted on his own accord. I didn't exactly provoke the kiss like I had last time. I walked down the stairs that next morning, wiping away the sleep from my eyes as I came to the door to the kitchen. Before I could enter, I heard hushed whispering from inside. Topic of discussion amongst the two in the room was mine and Norman's kiss yesterday on the beach while we were supposed to be training. I stopped where I was, placing my back against the wall and listening to what they had to say about what was obviously witnessed. You know, after the little show yesterday, I heard one girl say as I listened in, "It's obvious that they're sleeping together." "Yeah, I know that's right." Another said, that's why he placed her in the place of Luna. "Yeah, and he says he has gotten over his dead mate yet." The first girl said, "I say that's bullshit. I'm willing to bet." The second girl said, "Just nothing more than a simple lay to him anyway. He'll get his fill of her, then he'll move on." I could feel my wolf trying to push to the surface as what they were saying was disrespectful. I looked over towards the entrance of the hallway I was standing in just in time to see Jenna making her way towards me with a smile on her face, which quickly faded when she could see the look in my eyes. I motioned my head towards the door of the kitchen as she walked up, catching the end of what they were saying and realizing that those two girls were talking about not only me but her older cousin, their own alpha, too. Her eyes hardened and she made like she was going to go in there and give them a piece of her mind, but I simply shook my head before walking into the kitchen where the girls were and acting like I didn't hear a word they just said. "Good morning, Luna." They both said, but you could tell their little cheery act was just that, an act. "Good morning, girls," I said before casting a quick glance over at Jenna beside me. "Can we help you with anything this morning, Luna?" One girl asked, placing a fake smile on her face. "No thank you," I said, shaking my head. "I'm just going to grab a granola bar to eat before I go change and head back to training with Matt this morning." "Okay, well, have a good morning, Luna," she said before she and her friend left out of the kitchen. When they were well out of earshot, I watched as Jenna turned a glare towards me. "Why didn't you say anything to them both?" she asked. "I may not have heard everything you heard, but I know they were disrespecting not only you as Luna but also my cousin who is their own alpha." "I say something," I said, looking at her. "Then they'll know I was listening in and because you didn't show up till the end. They will deny everything that was said, because in their eyes no one of importance in this pack heard what was said but me." The outsider turned Luna. Jenna shook her head before turning and leaving me alone in the kitchen. I sighed as I stared down at the granola bar that I had originally picked up but placed down on the counter as I was talking to Jenna moments ago. "You okay?" a voice said to my right, causing me to jump and place my hand to my chest while I looked over to see that it had been Norman who had startled me. "God, Norman, you scared me," I said, glaring over at him while he simply smirked and shrugged. "I saw Jenna leave out of here pretty mad," he said, walking to stand beside me while I turned to fully face him. "Is everything okay?" "To an extent," I said, looking down and taking a deep breath. "Riley, what's wrong?" he asked, and when I looked up I could see the concern in his blue eyes. "A few moments ago, I started out. When I came down here to get a quick bite to eat before leaving to find Matt to begin our training for today, I heard two girls in here gossiping." "What's so bad about that?" he asked, looking confused. "They were gossiping about us," I said, looking away from him. "Because of that kiss on the beach yesterday. They were claiming that because of that, you've already gotten into bed with me. They say I'm just a quick lay for you, and that's the only reason I got the title of Luna." Jenna heard the end of their gossip and is made I didn't do or say anything. "Well, I'll say something," he said, and when I looked back at him his blue eyes looked almost black. "No one in my pack will disrespect me or their new Luna like that." "Norman don't," I said quickly as I grabbed his arm before he could walk away. "If you say anything regarding the rumor, they'll only think they're right because of how defensive you are, regardless of it being because they're disrespecting us." He looked down at me as he turned back to face me, my hand still on his arm as I pleaded with him with just my eyes, silently begging him not to do anything. "Something will eventually have to be said," he said quietly as he stared down at me. "They'll have to learn they can't just go around spouting off rumors about the heads they live in." He lifted his right hand, placing it on my left cheek before I responded to him. "Later," I whispered, looking up at him as I leaned into his hand. Then, just like yesterday on the beach, he lowered his head to mine before placing a soft kiss to my lips for the second time in 2 days. Chapter 13. It's been a week since Norman's passionate kiss on the beach during what should have been a training session. 7 days have passed without any sign of Blake or his pack attempting an attack. The warriors are beginning to wonder if hell ever strike, but my cautious nature keeps me on high alert. I fear they'll lower their guard, creating the perfect opportunity for Blake to launch his assault. My time with him taught me never to underestimate his coming. He's a master of striking when least expected. Given our pack's reputation as the largest, Blake will undoubtedly wait for the most opportune moment. His unpredictable nature means it could be years before he makes his move, long after we've forgotten the looming threat. But I haven't forgotten. My past experiences with Blake have ingrained in me a deep understanding of his capabilities. For now, I'm doing my best to keep the pack vigilant, ensuring we're prepared for any surprise attack he might orchestrate. Abigail has been under my care for a week now. True to his word, Norman followed through on his promise, making me her legal guardian. The joy that lit up her face when I told her I was essentially her new mom was truly heartwarming. I had always known she was attached to me, but witnessing her unbridled happiness at becoming mine was an indescribable experience. Earlier this week, after breaking the news to her, Abigail moved to a new room on the top floor, right next to mine. We spent the entire week, with Norman's help, painting the walls and decorating her space according to her wishes. And Abigail's desires were clear: princesses everywhere. Poor Norman emerged from her room nearly every day covered in pink and purple paint. Yet, he always left with a smile, cherishing these moments he never got to experience with a child of his own. We put the finishing touches on Abigail's room late last night, with her sleeping soundly in her old room until the new paint smell dissipated and the walls dried completely. I woke up early this morning, unsure of the reason, and found myself sitting on my bed in nothing more than a simple night shirt, the sheets spooled around my hips. Just then, a knock sounded at my door. "Really?" Norman's voice called out to the closed door. "CM on in Norman." I responded, and he slowly pushed the door open, peering into my room. "You want to get away for a while?" he asked, looking at me from the doorway. "Just you and me, away from the prying eyes and ears of the pack. You've been stressed more than me since we've gotten back. But won't the pack need its alpha?" I asked, arching an eyebrow at him as I waited for his answer. "They'll be all right for a day," he said, smiling. "But I can't have my Luna on the verge of a mental breakdown because of too much stress. Now get your butt out of bed and let's go do something. Just us." "Did you just call me your Luna?" I said as I lifted my eyebrow while a smirk appeared on my face, his own going a light shade of pink after realizing what he just said. "Just get dressed," he said quickly as he backed out of my room. "I'll meet you out front in a few minutes." I started laughing as he shut the door, leaving me to get dressed in private, sobering up, and wondering just what this strange man could have planned for just the two of us away from the rest of his pack. I climbed out of bed and pulled on some clean clothes. Once dressed, I walked out of my room, then down the stairs. Of course, not missing out on the familiar voices the two girls from the other day gossiping once again about Norman and myself like they had nothing better to do with their time. Continuing on like I hadn't heard them and refusing to let them ruin my day with Norman. I pushed their voices out of my head as I opened the front door to the pack house to spy Norman standing out front with none other than a motorcycle beside him. "Is this yours?" I asked, smiling as my eyes took in the beauty beside this man. "Why, yes it is," he said, smirking before straddling the seat. "Would you like a ride?" "Oh hell yeah, oh hell yeah," I said, causing him to laugh as I ran down the front steps before climbing onto the bike behind him, wrapping my arms around his midsection to hold on as he started the bike. "Hang on," he said, peering back at me over his shoulder as I gave him a wide smile while tightening my grip around him. I didn't ask Norman where it was we were going as he pulled off from in front of the house. I figured to let him surprise me, but I never expected him to take me back to that same small clearing we had visited back on my first day as his pack Luna just after my shoulder had healed up from the bite. Confused when he pulled to the edge of the clearing and stopped, turning the bike off in the process. I climbed off the bike and waited to see what he was doing. "What?" he asked, smiling as he climbed off when he saw the confused look on my face. "Why do you bring me here?" I asked, and even though I was confused as hell, I still cowed and stopped the smile that was on my face. "Because from your reaction that day we first came here," he said, smiling at me, "I knew you liked this place. And what better way to let go of stress than here? So this is why you brought me back here?" I asked, smiling at him as I looked around the clearing before looking back to him. "It's one reason," he said before holding his hand out to me, slightly confused. I grabbed his hand as I allowed him to lead me towards the center of the small field before he sat down on the grass, pulling me down with him, landing with a plop right beside him. I started laughing as I leaned my head against his shoulder slightly. "Norman," I whispered as I tried gaining my breathing back to normal. "Why are you acting like a teenager all of a sudden who's with his girlfriend?" When I didn't get an answer, I peered up at him as I still leaned slightly into his shoulder, my eyes looking back and forth between his as I waited to see what he'd say. "Norman," I asked with my smile faltering as I continued to wait for his response, but my heart was telling me to be prepared for him to shove me away. "Riley," he said as I watched him break eye contact with me and look down to his lap. "I don't really know what's going on right now." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused as he continued to stare at his lap. "Ever since that first kiss on the beach," he started, "and then that last one when we were training, my wolf has been going crazy when I don't at least see you for hours on end. I haven't felt this way. Not for a while since she died, and am just so confused." I felt my heart rate pick up as what he said sunk in. I was the only one feeling this, but it was confusing him to no end it seemed. Lifting my right hand, I gently placed it on his cheek, causing him to finally look back up and see me. "My wolf wants to fight for control every day," he said as he leaned his cheek against my hand, "wanting nothing more than to be around you. And then when I have to fight to keep from losing the control I have over him. Like right now, what does your wolf want?" I asked as I felt him turn his head slightly and placed a small kiss on the inside of my palm. "He's grown protective over you," he said, "especially after what your ex-mate said about you. He's seen the way the younger, unmated wolves look at you when you're not paying attention. He wants me to mark you. Claim you as ours so no one else will look at you like that again." My heart was hammering against my ribcage by now as I tried to keep my face cool. "And you?" I asked. "What do you want?" I watched as he peered at me, his blue eyes seeming to pierce right through to my soul as he slowly leaned towards me. My eyes fluttered shut, just his lips gently pressed against my own. I felt my breath leave out through my nose at the same time I felt him pry my lips open gently with his own just before his tongue snuck its way in. The kiss didn't last long before Norman pulled away, beating his forehead against my own as his blue eyes opened to reveal them to be darker than moments ago. "I want the same thing," he whispered out, his breath fanning against my face as his blue eyes peered down into my brown ones. "Are you sure?" I asked, wanting him to be absolutely sure about this. "You're right," he said with his forehead still resting against mine. "It's time I move on. Think about what would be best for the pack and not wallow in myself, pity over losing my mate. I've been given a second chance at happiness. So have you. So why should I make us both suffer any longer than we need to?" My hand, still resting on his cheek, even after the kiss slowly slid up to his hair before gripping onto it tightly and pulling him slightly closer. "Then what are you waiting for?" I asked as my eyes looked back and forth between his again before he leaned forward and pressed his mouth to mine in a harder kiss. I felt him push me until my back was lying flat on the ground and he was hovering over me, not even breaking the kiss in the process. My breathing picked up as he moved away from my mouth, placing kisses that started there at the corner of my lips and moved down along my jaw, and then my neck until he reached the junction when my neck connected with my shoulder. I felt his lips open as he began adding a little suction as he continued to search for the place he liked best. But when his lips found what he was looking for, all it took was a slight moan from me when he found my sweet spot before he added a bit more suction to the spot he had chosen. And then, just like that, I felt a sharp sting in my neck where he his mouth as he bit down onto where he wanted his mark in my soft flesh. The pain lasted barely a second before the most intense form of pleasure it ever felt took over my body, causing my back to arch up off the ground and into his chest still hovering over me. With my eyes closed as I enjoyed the feeling, I could see stars dancing around behind my eyelids before his mouth released its hold over my neck. I felt myself release a sigh as my body slowly began to relax and my breathing attempted to return to normal. Both of Norman's hands were on either side of my head as he held himself over me as my own had moved from his hair to bunch up his shirt on both sides, just under the arms, before I could open my eyes to try and focus on him. I felt his tongue gently swipe across my still tender neck, cleaning off any blood that may have come with him marking me. Just the feeling alone of him doing that sent a jolt of pleasure through me. Slowly, I opened my eyes and peered up at Norman as he peered down at me, his blue eyes back their normal shade of baby blue. I looked up at him, still trying to slow my breathing as I waited for him to speak first. "Now," he said finally after a few minutes while looking at the new mark he'd left on my neck. "You belong to me. I don't think you'd want it any other way." I whispered out weakly as I smiled up at him before he lowered his lips to mine, giving me another gentle kiss that I was growing to love more every time. Chapter 14. Everything seemed so different between Norman and me after he marked me. It was like my attraction to him increased significantly afterwards. We spent the entire day away from the pack, just him and I, enjoying each other's company while he took my mind off of the possible threat of attack from my former pack. When we finally got back to the pack house, it was late and most everyone else was already in bed. "I think I really needed that today," I said to him as I looked down to my feet while we walked up the stairs to our floor. "I just needed to take my mind off of everything going on. We'll have to do it again," he said, smiling at me as we reached my room door. I bit my lower lip as we stood in front of my door and looked up to him. "Good night, really," he whispered after a few minutes before he lowered his head and placed a gentle kiss on my lips. My eyes fluttered close for the few seconds the kiss lasted before I felt him slowly pull away. "Good night, Norman," I whispered back as I slowly opened my eyes to look at him. I smiled up at him as he lightly placed his hand on my cheek before he turned and walked down the hallway towards where his room was. Closing my eyes and taking a deep breath, I turned and walked into my room. I shut my door and changed into what I planned on sleeping in that night before I started making my bed up. As I was working on straightening my bed, there was a knock at my door. Yes, I called out, looking over my shoulder as my back was to the door. It's Jenna. Jenna's voice came from the other side of the door. Oh, come on in, I said before quickly moving my hair over my neck to hide Norman's mark from view for now. You two work on all day today, Jenna said as she walked into my room and walked around to the other side of my bed so that she was facing me. Abigail missed you. She kept asking where you went all day. Oh, I'm sorry, I said looking up at Jenna. Norman decided to take me away to get some fresh air and to get away from all the stress I was dealing with. And that took the whole day. Jenna asked, quirking an eyebrow at me. We lost track of time, I guess, I said, shrugging. I guess shrugging was the wrong thing to do because in that next second, Jenna's eyes were glued to my neck and shoulder. Jenna, I asked, watching her as she just continued to stare. She whispered, Is that what I think it is? I said, feeling my cheeks heating up. Oh my God, really? She squealed out. When? Today, I said, making it sound more like a question than an answer. I'm so happy for you, she said, running around my bed and instantly wrapping me in her arms. For both of you. Now I see why you both were gone all day today. Why did he mark you? It's kind of tricky to explain, I said as I sat on my bed. I just know it was because of that first time he kissed me. Before we went to my old pack without realizing that's who it was we were going to see. After that he said his wolf had been going crazy. So are you two like together now? She asked, smiling as I shrugged. I guess, I said, unsure. We didn't really discuss that. After he marked me, we just spent the day together. Although even now, after being marked, my wolf is going crazy because I'm not near him. Jenna went to open her mouth, but was halted by the sound of knocking at my door. That next second it opened to reveal Norman standing there peering in. The look on his face when he spotted Jenna beside me, and my hair moved over my shoulder revealing the mark he left, was priceless. So Norman, Jenna said, smirking as he walked into the room. When were you going to tell me that you marked Ms. Riley over here? When we finally announced it to the pack, he said, quirking up an eyebrow with a playful smirk. How do you find out anyway? She was trying to hide it, Jenna said, pointing to me. But when she shrugged her shoulders, the hair moved and the mark revealed itself to me. Norman, I'm so very happy for you both. Glad to know we've got your approval, he said with a smirk still on his face as he looked to me then back to her. But don't you need to be getting back home to Matt and your baby? Yeah, I see him not wanted here, she said, rolling her eyes and laughing before hugging me. I'll see you tomorrow, really. I watched with a smile as she stood up and walked to Norman, giving him a hug as well before walking out of the room and leaving it just the two of us. It was quiet for a moment between us, as Norman shifted his weight from one foot to the other as he glanced down at the floor. Was there something you needed, Norman? I asked, smiling, when you came and knocked on my door. I watched as his cheeks instantly heated up, causing me to have to cover my mouth to keep from laughing. He started as he looked at his feet. I cowed in sleep, and my wolf wanted to see you again. Just your wolf? I asked, raising one eyebrow to look at him. Well, I mean, I did too, he said quickly, which actually did cause me to laugh. Norman, I'm teasing, calm down, I said, standing up and walking to stand in front of him. I smiled up at him, my eyes going back and forth between his as I waited to see what he'd do. He peered down at me before slowly lowered his lips to mine as his arms moved out to circle around my waist and pull me closer to him. It didn't last long before he'd pulled away, his forehead resting against mine. I don't think my wolf will allow me to sleep at night now, he whispered, without you in bed next to me. Your wolf? I asked. Or you won't be able to sleep without me right next to you. I watched as his cheeks began to turn pink once more before I lifted my hand up to rest on his cheek as I smiled. Would you believe me if I said both? He asked, causing me to laugh. I might. I said, smiling. But before I go anywhere with you, I need to stop by Abigail's room. Jenna said she missed me today. We could do that, he said, smiling before grabbing my hand that was resting on his cheek and holding it in his own as he led the way out of my room and down the hall towards where Abigail's new room was located. I don't think I was ever truly going to get used to Norman holding my hand like this, no matter how many times he did after he marked me. When we got to Abigail's door, he let go of my hand as I pushed the door open as quietly as I could. When I peered in, the room was dark save for her little pink nightlight that lit up the room in a soft pink glow. I looked back to Norman for a second before I pushed the door open a little wider and quietly made my room. I smiled down at her as she slept so soundly in her bed. Carefully, I sat down on the edge of the bed before gently brushing the hair out of her face that had fallen there in her sleep. My simple touch caused her to stir, her little eyes opening sleepily as she peered up at me before a sleepy smile made its presence known on her face. Mommy. She smiled up at me, causing me to smile back down at her. That's right. Jess been calling me Mommy these past few days since I basically adopted her. And I didn't mind her calling me that. Hey, sweetie, I said as I gently stroked her head in the same place I had moved the hair. I heard you kept asking about me today. I'm sorry I was there. It's okay, Mommy, she said, smiling up at me still. I'll make it up to you, I said, smiling. Tomorrow we'll do something together. Just me and you and nobody else. How does that sound? Okay, she said, smiling widely. Well then, go back to sleep, I said, leaning forwards and placing a small kiss on the top of her head. And I'll see you first thing in the morning. Good night, Mommy, she said as she yawned before rolling onto her side. Good night, Abigail, I said before standing to my feet and walking back over to where Norman still stood by the door with a smile on his face. What? I asked as I walked out and he closed the bedroom door behind us. You're very good with her, he said as he wrapped his arm around my waist before leading the way towards his room. I love kids, I said, shrugging with a smile. And it broke my heart that Abigail had been asking about me all day when I was with you in that meadow. So I want to make it up to her by spending the day with her tomorrow. Well then, he said, smiling as he opened the door to his room. I guess we'd better get to sleep then. If I remember correctly for Jenna, Abigail wakes up early. I guess we'd better then, I said, smiling as I stood on my toes and gave him a light peck before moving around and going to the other side of his bed that was in the center of the room. Chapter 15. I woke the next morning, feeling like I was lying on a cloud instead of a bed. Last night was the best sleep by the years, since I was little before my parents were killed. I shift slightly on the bed, feeling something resting on my waist. When I look down, it's an arm and I can't help but smile as the memories of yesterday rush forward to remind me of why I'm in bed with someone. I turn slightly to look behind me to see Norman's face nuzzled into my hair behind me as his grip on my waist tightens just a bit. I smiled at the man behind me before trying to roll over onto my back without disturbing him as I do. When I get settled again, his arm still wraps securely around me. I reach my left hand up and gently brush away some of the hair out of his eyes. His grip tightens on my shirt by my side before it releases and I hear him groan as he starts to wake up. I watched as he slowly opens his blue eyes to look at me, a smile on his face when the sleep clears and he fully sees me. Good morning, I whisper to him as I repeat the action of brushing the hair from in front of his eyes. In that next second, he rolls over me, hovering above my body as he has my hands by my head while he smiles down at me. Good morning, he whispers back, his voice full of sleep still as he lowers his head and places a light kiss on my lips that leaves me wanting more. He pulls back to look at me before dipping his head back down and giving me another, longer kiss. Okay, Norman, I say, smiling as I pull back from his kiss while he goes straight for my neck. We need to get up. I promised Abigail I'd spend the day with her after not getting to see her yesterday. It seemed like he ignored me as he continued kissing down my neck, growing ever closer to the mark he'd given me. Okay, Alpha, rein it in, I said, pulling my hands from his and pushing him back slightly by his shoulders to where he was at ease instead of me peering at the top of his head. his hair creating a curtain around his face. I bit back a laugh at the sad look on his face. "No," I said, smiling as he poked out his bottom lip into a pout to try and get me to fold. "Not happening. I have a little girl that I promised would get to spend time with me. You'll see you tonight after I put her to bed." With a final shove from me, he rolled over back to his side of the bed so I could get up. I watched as he sat himself up slightly on his elbows as he decided to watch me get up from the bed and make my way towards the door. I turned back once I reached the door, smiled and waved at him, before walking out the door and closing it behind me. I was just reaching my bedroom door when I heard a little voice behind me. "There you are, Mommy," the little voice said, causing me to turn around and smile when I spot Abigail at the top of the stairs. "Where were you?" "I was around," I said, smiling at her. "But let me get dressed and get something to eat, then we can go out and do something. Just the two of us like I promised you last night, okay?" Okay, she said, smiling as she ran back down the stairs, causing me to laugh and shake my head. Abigail rushed me all through my breakfast after I got dressed and met her downstairs in the kitchen. All I could do was laugh as I finished my meal and put away the dirty dishes before taking her hand and following her out of the pack house. I held her hand tightly as we walked around, trying to figure out what the two of us could do for the day. We finally decided on a walk around the perimeter, but far enough away so that we weren't too close to the territory's edge. I made sure to let Norman know where we were and that we should be back by a certain time before we headed out in the direction of the woods. I wasn't sure if Abigail had been out this far, as she looked around everything with wide eyes and curiosity. "Can we play hide and seek, Mommy?" she asked, tugging on my hand, and looked up at me with big eyes as I looked down at her. "It's not that fun when it's just two people, Abigail," I said, looking down at her as she started to pout. "Please, Mommy," she said as she peered up at me. "One," I said, smiling as she grinned before letting go of my hand and running off in one direction while I covered my eyes and continued to count. I peeked through my fingers as I got closer to the final number before shouting it out and lowering my hands. Looking around for the small child I brought out here with me. "Ready or not, here I come," I shouted out as I looked around with a smile on my face for the little girl. I looked around and behind trees, rocks, and bushes. I knew she wouldn't run off far, or I would at least hope she knew better than to run too far after the rogue attack we had back after I joined this pack. My smile began to falter when I still hadn't found her. "Abigail, Abigail," I called out as I picked up my pace, looking for the child that I had been playing with out in the middle of the woods. My search became frantic when there was still no sign of her. "Abigail," I yelled. "Abigail, where are you?" "Mommy." I heard a faint scream come from the direction of the border. "Abigail," I yelled as I ran off in that direction. The child wasn't mine by birth, but it was almost like my motherly instincts kicked in, knowing she was in some sort of trouble. I crossed over the border to our pack's land without a second thought as I ran in search of Abigail. "Abigail," I yelled again, stopping for a second and looking around as I breathed heavily from the run. "Mommy," I heard her cry come from my left, closer than before but not close enough for me to know that I'd see her in a couple seconds without running to her. And running I did, in the direction her voice came from. I knew it was dangerous to be outside the pack territory, but my motherly instincts were pushing me towards finding her, and I was stopping until she was found. "Abigail," I cried in relief when I finally found her, but that relief was short-lived when I saw she had her hands tied behind her back, going on the defense. I looked around for any signs of a threat before making my way over towards her. Putting my attention back on her, I moved in closer and going for what was binding her hands behind her back. "Look out," Abigail shrieked, staring off behind me. I quickly turned around to see a man, familiar looking but at the same time not. I was on the defensive once again as I moved away from Abigail in case this should turn into a fight. The last thing I wanted was for her to get hurt. I went to make a move towards him, this evil smirk on his face, before I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head and the world went black. When I finally came to, my head hurt something awful and my wrists felt like they were on fire. Groaning, I opened my eyes slowly as I looked around at my surroundings. "Mommy," A small voice came from in front of me, my eyes shooting wide open. I looked ahead to see Abigail looking at me with scared eyes as she stood behind a set of bars. "Mommy," she asked, looking at me with tear stains on her cheeks like she'd been crying. "Are you okay?" Before answering her, I looked up to see why my wrists were hurting. I was shackled to the ceiling, and if I had to guess, there was silver mixed in with the iron of the cuffs. I looked back down to Abigail and went to speak when I was cut off by an all-too-familiar voice. "Ah, you're finally awake." The voice said that belonged to none other than Blake. Good, now the fun can really begin. Chapter 16. "You can keep me, but let Abigail go," I said through gritted teeth as Blake threw another punch into my stomach, and the chains holding my wrists being the only thing keeping me from hitting the ground in pain. "She's just a child, Blake," I growled when he started laughing. Like what I said was the funniest joke in the world or something. I wasn't sure how long it'd been there before I woke up to see her in that cage. What's worse, she has to sit there and watch as I get the shit beat out of me. I could take it. I have before, but I didn't want her to have to see that. I looked at Abigail, tears in her eyes as she watched what this man she'd never seen before was doing. Before I could turn my attention back to Blake, I felt a hard punch to the side of my jaw, causing my head to in the opposite direction the blow had come from. "I'm not letting the kid go just so she can run back to your alpha and get help." He sneered down at me as I let my head dangle after the punch. "You're mine now, really." I closed my eyes for a second, just wanting the pain to go away as my wrist burned more and more with every blow he gave me as my weight pulled down on the restraints that held me up. "Mommy," Abigail's voice shouted out, and causing me to open my eyes slowly. I felt my hair on my shoulder being moved by a hand before the sound of cursing came from close by. Lifting my head, I looked down to my shoulder and realized that he'd seen the mark left there by Norman. A mate's mark. "Why didn't you tell me she'd been marked?" I heard Blake's urgent and harsh whisper as I looked over to Abigail. "I didn't know. One of the other guys in the room says." They both looked back to me as I turned my attention to them. "What are we going to do, Alpha?" "Get rid of the kid," Blake said with a flick of his wrist like she meant nothing at all. "You'll deal with her." At that point, knowing that now Abigail's life was in danger, my wolf was up to the surface and I was about to hold her back. "No," I shouted out, and catching the two off guard as the guy went to go towards Abigail. Blake glared at me before moving towards me, but he was prepared with the knowledge of the fact. He'd been training. Grabbing a hold of the chain above me, I lifted myself up with my arms and kicked both feet out towards him, hitting him in the stomach. When Blake hit the floor, I looked over to the other guy to see he was stalking his way towards me. I could hear Abigail crying out in the background as I turned my attention to the chains above my head and was working on trying to get out of them. When you have nothing to lose, really, or in my case motherly instincts were kicking in, you don't care how you get out of a situation as long as you can. Looking back down to the guy, he was getting too close and I was still chained, growling in frustration. When he was within range, I kicked him in his family jewels and smirked with satisfaction as he fell to the floor holding his crotch and groaning. I looked back up at the cuffs, trying to at least slip them so I could get my hands free before glancing back to check on the two men in the room and make sure they weren't coming at me yet. Satisfied that Blake at least was down for now, I turned my attention back to my hands as they slowly began to slip out of the cuffs. But of course that hurt like a real bitch. With a final jerk of my hands, they were free, rubbing my wrists, which were bloody and raw and sore as hell. I looked around for the key to the cell that Abigail was standing in. "Mommy, look out." I heard her voice call out as I had my back to her and the rest of the room. Turning around quickly, I only had enough time to dodge out of the way of the guy making a lunge for me, but just barely. I moved back away from where he was and watched as he turned around and glared at me, hatred in his eyes. "Stupid bitch," he snarled before lunging at me again, but this time I didn't back out of his way. I sidestepped slightly before lifting my knee and catching him in his gut. Grabbing to fistful of hair, I brought his face down hard on my knee, knowing him out cold instantly. Looking back to Blake, he was still down on the floor, glancing at Abigail as she watched me. I quickly turned and went back to the table I had previously been looking at and looked for the keys to get her out. Keys, I whispered as I tossed everything to the side looking. Where are the damn keys? Ah, here we go. I quickly turned back around and ran for the cell door, jamming the key inside after finding the right one and unlocking it. Mommy, she cried out as she ran into my arms once the door was opened. I hugged her tightly, my wolf already starting to calm down slightly as soon as she was safe in my arms. The adrenaline running low in my system now. All the beating it took before was starting to affect me, and I needed to get her as safety before I let it take over. Abigail, I said, pulling away from her at arm's length so I could look at her. Mommy, your wrist, she said, peering down at them after I moved them to hold her arms. I know, I whispered. It'll be okay, but you need to listen to me. I'm going to get us out of here, but I have to shift so we can move faster. When I do, you are to climb onto my back, and you are to hold on tight. Understand me? Yes, Mommy, she whispered, nodding before I picked her back up, holding her tightly to me. I looked around before running to the door that led to some stairs that went up to the main floor of the house. It's a good thing I know my way around, I whispered more or less to myself before I cautiously made my way up to the ground floor. Looking around through the doorway at the top of the stairs, I waited to make sure the coast was clear before I ran for the front house that I was now in. I threw the door open, not caring if someone saw or heard me now as I made a dash for the trees. If they followed me, they'd stop at their territory line, because I'm sure by now Norman was looking for us, and last thing they'd want to do for now would be to piss off an already angry older alpha. Stop her! I heard a shout behind me, and when I looked over my shoulder, I saw that it was Blake, running faster. I disappeared into the tree line before setting Abigail on her feet and shifting into my white wolf, not caring about shredding my clothes I was wearing. I found myself in my wolf form before I lay down so Abigail could climb onto my back. Glancing at my front paws, you could see the red and tender flesh from where those shackles had been, and they still hurt, but I was pushing through the pain to get back to the safety of Norman's pack. Feeling Abigail lay as flat as she can on my back and hold on tightly, I looked over my shoulder as I stood up, the sound of the approaching threat getting louder. Facing forwards once more, I pushed my feet to run, carrying me and Abigail as far from here as fast as possible. I could feel my wolf tiring out as we continued to run. I was sure how far I was from home. I never paid much attention in the car that day with Norman when he first found out about Blake being my ex-mate. I didn't care if I had to push myself to run past exhaustion. I was stopping until I was in familiar territory. And even then I was stopping until we were both safely in our beds back at the pack house where Blake cowled and get to us so easily without a fight. I glanced over my shoulder, looking behind me to see if any of his pack had caught up with me, but I knew they hadn't. I was a fast runner, but then again I could never be too careful, and I was as fast as an alpha either. My pace slowed only slightly when I could see the familiar area that was home, but the sight before me made me want to weep with tears of joy. Running full speed towards Abigail and me were 5 wolves, and the big black one at the front told me that Norman was with them and leading them. Mommy, look! Abigail shouted, sitting up as my pace slowed considerably, the beatings and exhaustion hitting me full force before Norman and the others even reached me. Without even knowing what happened, I found myself on the ground and fighting to keep my eyes open. Mommy! I heard Abigail's voice as I felt her small hands on the back of my neck while I watched Norman shift and pull on a pair of shorts before reaching me. Riley, he said with his voice weak with worry. Keep your eyes open for me, please. I felt my body shift back to human form, leaving me naked in front of everyone there and causing me to curl up into fetal position. I could feel Norman's eyes on me as he took an ever cut and bruise on my body after what Blake did before his eyes landed on my wrist. I heard him growl before the next thing I know I'm wrapped in a blanket and lifted it into, not Norman's arms but Matt's. When I look for Norman, I see HES transformed back into the beautiful black wolf of his. Hold on, really. I hear Matt whisper before I feel myself placed on Norman's back and my eyes finally close as exhaustion takes over. Chapter 17. She just needs rest, Alpha. I heard the familiar voice of the pack doctor speaking into the blackness that surrounded me. Shall wake up when she's ready. I felt something small lying against my side with my arm around them as I took in my surroundings with just my senses of sound, smell, and feeling as my eyes wouldn't open yet. I could hear the same familiar, yet annoying, sound of the heart monitor and smelt the same disinfectant as last time. I was in the room used as the PAC's hospital ward once again, and it doesn't surprise me either. If I had to guess, the small object against my side that was in my arms would be Abigail lying beside me. Don't give me that. I finally heard Norman's reply to what the doctor said moments ago. It's been a few days since we got her back and she still hasn't woken up. Had it really been a few days since I escaped Blake back at my old pack house when he kidnapped me and Abigail? Quit your bickering. I finally managed to whisper out, my voice hoarse and raw from not using it and causing the room I was in to fall quiet. Riley? Riley? I heard Norman's voice call out with relief flowing through it as I felt his hands grasp my free one that washed around Abigail. As I slowly opened my eyes, I realized that I felt a strange and annoying sensation on my nose. So when I looked down, I spotted the breathing tube connected to it. Taking my hand away from Norman for a second, I lifted it up and pulled the cord away from my nose and tossed it aside before letting him take my hand once more. Don't ever scare me like that again, really, Norman said as he released my hand before placing both of his on my cheeks to make me look at him. I'm sorry, Norman, I whispered as I peered up at him, his blue eyes seeming to be rimmed with red like he'd been crying or hadn't slept any. Mommy, I heard a say before both Norman and I looked down to the little girl that had been sleeping in my arms. Hey, sweetie, I said, smiling as she peered up at me and a smile face when she realized I was awake. Mommy, she said as she sat up quickly before tightly wrapping her arms around me in a hug. Hey, sweetie, I said, hugging her back as I looked up to see Norman smiling at the sight of me hugging this little girl. After a few minutes, Abigail snuggled back into my side and seemed to be out within seconds. She stayed right there on that bed the whole time since we brought you both back, Norman said after a few minutes when I was still staring at the little girl in my arms. I bet you didn't leave this room either, I said, looking at him. Didn't you get any sleep, Norman? You'll sleep tonight when you're back in bed beside me, he said as I peered up at him, seeing the love in his eyes that I don't think had been there in so long. The doctor going to let me go tonight? I asked with a smile. He said as soon as you woke up you'd be able to, Norman said as he reached down and grabbed my hand once more. I was so scared, really, when I watched you collapse out there. I thought I was about to lose you two. You're not going to lose me, Norman, I said, squeezing his hand tightly. Can't get rid of me that easily now. I watched as he smiled before he looked to our hands. I think we should announce tomorrow that I've claimed a new mate, he said after a few minutes before he lifted his blue eyes to look at me. But only if you're ready for me to. It's your call, Norman, I said, smiling at him. But it's your say to, really. He countered. It involves you just as much as it involves me. Then I guess we're telling everyone tomorrow, I said, smiling as I watched him smile back at me. With this threat from Blake, it'd probably be best to tell the pack now. They'd be able to help Norman protect me. But that also means that I will have someone watching me all the time now. Later that afternoon, I was finally released from the hospital ward in the pack house and allowed to walk around. But of course Norman was by my side the entire time. Most of the pack, if now all. I found out what happened to me by now, and every member that spotted me walking around asked how I was feeling and if I was okay. It felt so weird that people were genuinely worried about me, but it was a good kind of weird. Every time, they'd smile and tell them I was a survivor, that nothing could keep me down for long. By the time Norman got me upstairs to our room, I don't guess he was going to allow me to sleep in the room I'd been given anymore. It was late and Abigail had already been put to bed for the night. I was in nothing more than one of his large shirts while he was in only a pair of pajama bottoms as we laid down on the bed together. Not exactly tired as of yet. I don't think I really pictured this man as one to cuddle, but after that first night I shared a bed with him, that quickly changed. We were lying above the covers for now. All the lights in the room off and the only light came from outside by the moon above. I was pulled close to his side, his arm wrapped around my waist as my head rested on his shoulder. He was on his back while I was on my side, facing him, with my hand placed on his chest. "I didn't mean to scare you," I whispered out into the silence after a while as I felt his hand tighten on my hip where it rested. "I know you did," he whispered back after a few minutes. "But you and Abigail are back safe and sound, and that's all that matters to me right now." I sat up slightly to look at him, a smile on my face. Why Calden I had been paired with someone like you instead of that asshole I had? I asked as his face darkened slightly at the mention of Blake. "Let's not worry about him," he said before he pushed me onto my back and rolled to hover over me. "You're with me now, and I'll never let anything bad happen to you again if I can help it." I smiled up at him as his dark brown hair framed his face as he peered down at me, his arms supporting his weight above me just like they had the other morning when I first woke up in bed with him. I watched as his blue eyes seemed to take in every detail of my face before they lingered on my lips and then down to my neck where my marks at his mark. I bit down slightly on my lower lip as I peered up into his blue eye, my arms moving to rest up on his shoulders. A second later, he lowered his head towards mine before his lips pressed gently against my own, the scruff of his chin tickling my chin. He brought his body closer to mine, but still keeping his weight off of me, as my hands clasped behind the back of his head to hold him in place as I enjoyed the kiss. After a few minutes, I felt his tongue dart out to pry my lips open so that he could deepen the kiss. I didn't hesitate to allow him access. His body was now pressing against mine, as I allowed his tongue to search the familiar territory of my mouth. He pulled away from my mouth, leaving little opened mouth kisses in his wake as his lips traveled down from the edge of my lips and down towards the mark before kissing all around the edge of it. I bit my lip hard to suppress a moan as he finally placed his lips on the mark and began sucking gently on the patch of flesh. My eyes closed as I enjoyed the feeling, but it didn't last long before he pulled back from my neck and then lifted his body off of mine. Opening my eyes, I peered up at him confused as he seemed to be having some sort of inner battle behind his blue eyes. "We need to stop now," he whispered, "or I won't be able to stop at all." "I don't want to stop," I said before bringing his lips right back to my own. Chapter 18. He pulled back after a couple of seconds, looking down into my eyes. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "There's no rush." "I'm sure," I said, smiling up at him. "People might think everything about our relationship is rushed, but I don't care. I've never been so happy like I am now since the day you first kissed me." I watched as he smiled down at me, moving his hand so that he could brush his thumb against my cheek. "Every time I look at you since that day," he said with his blue eyes peering down at me, "I seem to fall more for you every time where it got so hard to keep from marking you. Then that day in the meadow when you said I could mark you. My wolf and I were so happy." "Enough talking, Norman," I said, smiling up at him as I brushed my own hand against his cheek. "I'm ready now." Smiling, he brought his lips back down to mine as he moved his hand away from my cheek. I felt that hand come to rest against my inner thigh, just under the hem of the shirt I was wearing. I pulled out of the kiss and looked down to his hand with a smile as he sat back on his legs, using both hands to grip the hem of the shirt and slowly lift it up and pull it over my head, leaving me in nothing more than my bra and panties. He tossed the shirt away before he bent over and placed soft kisses on the exposed flesh of my chest that was covered by the bra I was sporting. I smiled down at him, biting my lower lip to suppress a moan as his kisses left the kiss of the skin of my chest tender and sensitive to his touches. My back arched to one point, allowing him to reach behind and unclasp the hook to my bra. He wasted no time before pulling the bra away from my body, exposing my breasts to him for the first time. I felt a blush creep up onto my cheeks as he stared down at my chest before lowering himself down so that he was lying flat against me between my thighs as he attached his mouth to my right nipple. I felt a breathless gasp leave me as his warm mouth attached to me, the stubble on his chin tickling my hypersensitive skin. His fingers trailed lightly up and down my sides, tickling me at my ribcage and causing goosebumps to rise on my flesh in his fingers' wake. "You're so responsive," he mumbled as he pulled his mouth away from my nipple to smile up at me before he moved on to the left one. "Norman," I moaned out as the sensation became too much, and I was becoming too impatient. I felt his body shake with a deep laugh as he pulled away from me completely as he lifted himself up by his arms until he was hovering over me. "Some owns impatient," he said, smiling down at me before lowering his mouth to mine once again as one of his hands started at the base of my neck and slowly trailed down my body, going between the valley of my breasts and circling around my belly, but before tracing the hem of my panties, goose and strizing where our skin touched. "Just how wet have I made you, baby girl?" he whispered as his voice seemed to deepen while his fingers snuck under the fabric of my panties. I sucked in a gasped breath as his fingers moved lower until they were lightly tracing my lower lips before dipping between my moist folds as he watched my face and reaction to his movements. "You're so wet, baby girl," he groaned out as he moved his fingers up and down along my slit before whirling them around the sensitive jewel at the top, causing my body to twitch and jerk slightly from the new sensation I was feeling. He groaned out again before lowering his head until his lips landed on my mark where he began to nibble lightly on it. I moaned out, unable to stop myself from the overload of pleasure I was receiving at that point in time. In that next second, his fingers moved away from my sensitive pleasure button and down to my entrance where he slowly inserted one finger. My eyes clamped shut as my legs opened more, giving him better access to what he was doing, before I felt my hips rising up to meet the small thrusts he was doing with his finger. "You like that?" he asked as he pulled away from my neck as I could feel his eyes on me before I opened mine to look up at him. "Norman," I whispered out breathlessly. "Please." He groaned out before removing his hand from me and pulling it out from inside my panties. I watched as he brought his finger up to his lips, tasting me on him before he placed his hands on either side of my hips and slowly began to tug my panties down and finally leaving me completely bare to his eyes as he tossed them to the side with his shirt, before he could lean back down over me. I sat up slightly, my hands finding his waistband and tugging his boxers and pajama bottoms down over his hips. I got them down to his knees that he was putting his weight on before he pulled my hands away and lifted his legs to kick them off into the floor. I stared at his proudly standing erection, mesmerized by the sight of it, before he lightly pushed me on my back and moved my thighs apart so that he could situate himself between them once again. I looked down, watching as he edged closer and closer to my waiting entrance before his hand lifted up and lifted my chin up so that I was looking up at him. "I'll try and be as gentle as I can," he whispered as he peered down at me, his blue eyes showing worry that HED hurt me more than what was in his control. Nodding my understanding, I brought my hand up to the back of his neck and pulled him closer so I could bring his lips to mine once again just as I felt the tip of his shift nudging at my lower lips. Taking a deep breath, I willed my body to relax as he used his tongue to pry my lips open and deepen the kiss just as forward, sharply taking my innocent cess away that I had saved for my first mate but never got to give until now. I pulled my mouth away from Norman's as I whimpered out in pain and bit my lower lip to keep from crying out louder. "Shh," Norman whispered soothingly as he used his hand to brush away the strand of hair that moved into my face as he stilled any other movement. "I'm sorry, baby girl. It'll pass. I promise." I closed my eyes tightly as I felt a traitorous stare slowly slide down my cheek, only to be caught by Norman's thumb as he gently glided it across my cheek soothingly. "Are you all right?" he asked after a couple of minutes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I whispered back, my voice sounding weak as I slowly opened my eyes and looked at him, forcing a small but genuine smile onto my face. I lifted my hand up to his cheek, looking up into his blue eyes, before I used the hand to bring his mouth back to mine as I wiggled my hips slightly to get him to move now that the pain had lessened. He smiled into the kiss, not releasing my lips as he slowly pulled out and pushed back in just as slowly, trying to make this last as long as it should for my first time. I moaned out into his mouth as he hit all the right places deep inside me, places I didn't even know could hold so much pleasure to them as he slowly picked up his pace. His lips slowly left mine, allowing me to gap open with soundless gasps coming from me as he continued his assault on my body, leaving a trail of kisses from my mouth all the way down to the mark on my shoulder. "You like that, baby girl," he whispered against the mark as he picked up the pace again with his thrust, making it harder for me to even make a sound or even focus on answering him for that matter. My arms were wrapped around his shoulders, holding him in place above me as his mouth returned to my mark. I felt it burning deep in the pit of my stomach and traveling lower into my abdomen, creating a sort of knot feeling. And when he decided to bite down on the mark again, I knew I was done for. His member hitting that special spot and sliding down onto the mark she'd given me. I felt the knot tighten before completely loosening up and my climax swashing over me in a tidal wave. I cried out his name as I felt my walls clenching around him as he continued the thrust into me, allowing me to ride out the intense orgasm as he tried to reach his own release. He pulled his mouth away from my shoulder before crashing his lips into mine just as I felt his shaft twitch inside, followed by the warmth of his seed as it poured into me. As he came down from his high, he rested his forehead against mine as he pulled his lips away from my own and closed his eyes, our chests heavily rising and falling with our ragged breathing. I watched him as he took his time to regain his normal breathing, his head still resting against mine as he held his body weight up by his arms while his member was still tucked away inside. Slowly softening, he slowly opened his eyes. A smile crossing his face appeared down at me before placing a light peck on my lips. I winced slightly as he rolled off of me, his spent member pulling out. "Did I hurt you?" he asked, having obviously noticed the wince I made. "No," I said, shaking my head and looking over at him with a smile. That was the best feeling I ever had. That pain in the start was only natural, but you didn't hurt me in the way you're thinking. He nodded hesitantly before wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me flush against him so that he was spooning me. "You know," he said after a few minutes of silence, "every onus going to know we're fully mated now, whether they knew about your mark or not. They'll smell our scents as being mixed instead of just combined." I know," I said, smiling even though he cowled and see it as he rested his head into the back of my hair. "We're still telling the pack tomorrow, right? About you claiming me as your mate?" "Yes," he whispered out as his arm tightened around me, "but maybe we could add something else to the list of things we're announcing to them tomorrow." "Like what?" I asked, curious as I turned slightly to look at him over my shoulder as he propped himself up on the arm he was laying on. "Marry me, really," he said with a look of total seriousness, as all I could do at that moment was gasp in shock. Once, I thought I would be alone for the rest of my life, until I met him, the pack alpha of the werewolves. He made me find a sense of home in his pack. We fell in love and decided to get married, and I thought I would live a happy life from then on. But fate always likes to play tricks. My ex-mate came back with the purpose of revenge. He not only threatened my life, but also put me in a moral dilemma. Chapter 19. I gazed at Norman, speechless, still enveloped in his strong arms as his proposal sank in. The pack leader, who had suffered such heartache in his previous marriage to his true mate, was asking me to be his wife. The irony of the moment was lost on me. "Some timing there," I said with a soft chuckle, my eyes meeting his. "Are you sure this is what you want? I mean, I'd expect marriage to be the last thing on your mind after what happened last time." Norman's blue eyes, deep as the ocean and just as mysterious, peered into mine. "You're right," he admitted, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down my spine. For a while, it was the last thing on my mind. But a lot of thoughts I had about never remarrying or never finding my second mate have changed since you've entered my life. Really, with everything that's going on, yes, I'm scared to lose you if you were to marry me. But it'd be even more devastated if I never asked you and you were still taken from me. My heart swelled with emotion, squeezing tightly in my chest. The truth in his words was palpable, the love evident even though our time together had been relatively short. "Yes, I'll marry you," I whispered, watching as a radiant smile broke out on Norman's face. His hand, calloused from years of leadership and protection, cupped the back of my head, drawing me in for a kiss that was both tender and passionate. When we finally parted, I saw a happiness in Norman's blue eyes that I suspected had been absent for far too long. "After we announce everything to the pack," he said, gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear, "you and I will go to a jeweler and find an engagement ring to make it official. Then we need to be getting to sleep," I whispered, suddenly aware of the monumental day ahead of us. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. The next morning, as Norman and I prepared for the announcement, nervous energy thrummed through my body. I opted for simple attire, knowing most of the pack wouldn't dress up. When Norman emerged from the bathroom in a casual t-shirt and jeans, mirroring my own outfit, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Are you ready?" he asked, his strong arms encircling my waist as he pulled me against his chest. We stood before the floor-length mirror, a picture of unity and strength. "Just nervous," I admitted, meeting his gaze in the reflection. "The pack already loves you." "Really? You know that?" he reassured me, his breath warm against my ear. "Yeah." I smiled softly, drawing comfort from his presence. "Will your hair up?" Norman suggested, his lips brushing my ear and sending a shiver down my spine. "So that they can see your mark." I nodded as he stood back from me to allow me to move to my old room and grab a hair bow, walking out of my room as I pulled my hair back into a high ponytail. I walked over to Abigail's door and peered in, seeing her already dressed for the day. "Mommy." She smiled at me before running to me. I was still a little sore after the incident with Blake, so when she jumped onto me, I held and stopped myself from wincing. "Easy there, kiddo," Norman said, walking up behind us after obviously seeing my wince. "She's still healing up after what happened the other day." "Sorry, Mommy," she said, looking up at me sadly, like she thought she was in trouble for hurting me. "You didn't mean to, sweetheart," I said, hugging her tightly to show I was mad at her. "Okay, ladies," Norman said, placing his hand on the back of my shoulders as he looked at the two of us. "We need to be moving on. We've got a pack waiting for us outside." Abigail looked up at me confused while I simply smiled and shook my head, signaling for her to be patient and wait. Taking her small hand in mine, we followed Norman down to the front of the house and then outside to the waiting crowd. Even though she has been around them her whole life, Abigail finds herself shyly hiding behind my leg as we stand on the porch while the pack simultaneously bows their heads to both Norman and I as we step out on the porch. As every Ona's head began to lift, you could hear a collection of gasps every couple of seconds as they spotted the mark resting on my neck that Norman had given me a few days ago. Norman hadn't spoken yet, as we waited for everyone to settle down before he dropped the bomb of us now being fully mated and engaged. "All right, everyone," Norman said, raising his hand that watched resting on the back of my shoulder. "As you all have noticed, Really now bears a mate's mark on her shoulder. But what you do not know is that mark is mine." You could hear the collective gasps once more as Norman let what he said sit with the pack. I looked out, noticing Jenna and Matt standing close to the front, Jenna smiling up at me where I stood. I knew she was happy for me. As we'd grown so close before Norman I got together like this. But more importantly, I knew she was happy for him and finally moving on. "Settle down," Norman called out, raising his hand once more to get the whispering to cease so that he could continue. Now is when I felt my palms start to sweat and became nervous all over again. I looked out through the crowd again as Norman waited for the last of the whispers to die down. "You all knew this pack needed a new Luna." Norman spoke loud and clear. "And I know a majority of you believe in the myths of us having second chance mates if something should happen to our first. Riley Black is my second chance mate. I didn't know it at first, and I didn't believe in them either. But I finally found out recently that she is. And the day before she and Abigail were taken, she allowed me to mark her. I watched as the crowd cheered at the announcement of Norman having a new mate who he'd already marked. That's not all," he called out as he peered at the crowd while they settled down. "As of last night, Really and I have now fully mated and she has accepted my proposal of becoming my wife." I watched the crowd erupt into cheers once more as I felt Norman slide his hand down from my shoulder to around my waist, where he then pulled me against him. I rested my head on his shoulder, a small smile on my face, as we watched the crowd call out their congratulations to Norman and I. As the crowd began to shrink in size, everyone going back to starting their day, Jenna and Matt ran up the stairs toward Norman. Abigail, Adele, and I still stood. Jenna wrapped me in a tight hug as Matt congratulated Norman. Who knew I would lol found my place to be here next to Norman with my new friends Jenna and Matt. And my adopted daughter Abigail. I'm so happy for you, Jenna said, smiling as she pulled away from the hug. Thanks, I said, smiling as we both looked to Norman just as the sound of someone else approaching and clearing their throat caught our attention. Never thought I'd hear you tying the knot again, Ritas, a man said, standing at the bottom of the step, smiling up at Norman while he grinned down at this newcomer. Never thought I would either, Norman said as he walked down to the stranger and wrapped him in a hug as they both smiled and patted each other's backs. I looked to Jenna confused while she just smiled and looked back to the men in front of us. Riley, Norman said when he pulled away from the guy and looked back to me. Come here, I want to introduce you to someone. Slowly, I walked down the stairs to stand by Norman, a kind smile on my face as I waited. Riley, this is an old friend of mine, he said. This is Alpha Sean Flannery. Sean, this is my fiancé mate, really Black. It's nice to meet you, Alpha, I said kindly to him as he smiles back at me. Please call me Sean, he says, and it's nice to know someone could bring the old Ritas back. This guy has been nothing but depressing since he lost his wife. You brought him back. I'm grateful to see my best friend as himself once again. I smiled at him as Norman wrapped his arms around my shoulders and pulled me tightly to him. I asked a couple of my allies to come and date us with the problem of your ex-mate, Norman said after a few minutes. Sean here has offered to help, and I have another friend coming in from London with his warriors that should be here any day now. Blake won't be getting to you again. And this time, well, be ready if he decides to make a move to harm you. I looked to Norman, and then to his friend Sean before us. Well, keep you safe, really, Sean said, smiling at me. No one wants to see what'll happen to Norman if he loses you two. You'll be safe as long as there are people here willing to protect you. And I don't think that'll be a problem, judging from this pack's reaction to not only his marking you, but also to the engagement and pole mating. This pack already loves you. Thank you, I said, smiling as I watched Sean hold his arms out for me, waiting for me to hug him, not putting a second thought to it. I walked forwards out of Norman's grasp and allowed Sean to wrap his arms around my shoulders in a hug. When I looked to Norman, he was smiling, seeming happy that one of his friends approved of me and also of our engagement. At that moment, it never felt more safe than I did now, knowing there were people who did keep me safe from Blake. Chapter 20. It's been about another week since Norman and I fully mated and got engaged. His friend Sean has stayed around, helping train with some of the other warriors of our pack, and has been telling me all these funny stories about him and Norman when they were younger. Today I was practicing dodging blows with Matt as Norman had gone out to pick up his friend from the airport. Not sure, but something told me that even with this training I was doing, because I was now fully Norman's mate, I probably wouldn't be doing any fighting like I had that last time with the rogues when I protected Abigail. I was standing next to Matt. We were taking a small break as I took a sip of water to try and cool off from the exercise we were just doing. I glanced down at the ring I now wore on my left ring finger that I got to help pick out with Norman that same day we announced our engagement to the pack. It was simple, and I wouldn't allow Norman to buy anything else because it wouldn't be me otherwise. It was a larger single square cut dime on a white gold band with smaller accent diamonds along the top of the band. I really liked it for its simplicity, and Jenna told me it was perfect just for me when she saw it later the same day after getting it. I was so caught up in staring at the 4 and ring on my finger that I didn't realize I had been staring at it for so long until I felt small arms wrap around my leg. Looking down, I smiled when I spotted Abigail being the culprit behind catching my attention. Look, Mommy, she said before lifting one arm and pointed to the road just in time for the sound of all the vehicles to register in my ears. I couldn't help but smile as I spotted Norman's car in the lead, followed behind what could be referred to as an army of cars behind it. I looked over to my right at the sound of footsteps and was surprised really when I realized it was Sean. That must be Andy, he said, staring at the cars as they slowed to a stop in front of the pack house. I think you'll like him. He's a good guy. I glanced at him and nodded once when he looked back at me before my attention returned to the cars just as Norman was climbing out of his. A stranger climbing out of the passenger side after him, taking Abigail's hand. I walked over to the cars where Norman still stood talking with the other man, Sean following behind us. When we drew closer, Norman stopped talking and smiled over at me while his friends seemed to get the message and smiled too. "You must be this new maid I've been hearing about," the stranger said with a clear British accent as he caught my attention away from Norman. "It's nice to meet the one who was able to steal Norman's heart here." "I don't think I've done that," I said as I felt a blush creep up onto my cheeks. "Believe me," Sean said from beside me. "You have." I smiled at Sean before looking back to Norman and his new friend, waiting for an introduction. "This is Alpha Andrew Lincoln," Norman said after a few seconds. "Hes the Alpha from the largest pack over in the United Kingdom. Andy, this is my maiden fiancée, really black." "And who's this cute little girl?" Andy asked, looking down to Abigail as she tried to hide my leg while peering up at him with a nervous smile. "This is Abigail," I said, placing my hand on the back of her head as Andrew looked up at me. "My adopted daughter. Just an original member to Norman's pack, but after I joined I became attached. It sort of helps that I saved her life from a rogue attack back when I first joined. That was when she proved to most of the pack that she was meant to be a Luna," Jenna's voice said, suddenly coming up behind me. I turned around and smiled at her as she sent me a smile before going up to greet Andrea. "It's good to see you again, Jenna," he said as she hugged him tightly. "How are things between you and Matt?" "They're fine," she said, smiling as she stepped back. "But you're not here to learn about my life. You're here to help protect our well eyes." "That's right," he said, nodding before looking to me. "Norman wouldn't tell me a thing about what's going on until we got here. Just kept saying that another Alpha was threatening your life, even went as far as kidnapping you and little Abigail here if I remember correctly. So why don't we go inside so we can discuss what's going on?" "Right this way," Norman said, motioning towards the pack house before he placed his hand on the small of my back and turned me around to push me towards the house. I left Abigail with Jen so she wouldn't have to listen to what was going on and why all these strangers were here. Just a child after all. I sat there beside Norman in his office as we explained to Andrew and Sean the severity of the situation at hand. Norman's arm was wrapped tightly around my waist as I sat lay on his lap, while we watched as Andrew and Sean allowed what was said to fully sink in. They barely knew me, Sean having a tiny head start on Andrew with meeting me, and yet they both seemed to already show a sort of protectiveness over me that I was used to. They said they couldn't believe how someone could treat a person as kind and sweet as I was so harshly. But the grins on their faces when I told them I fought back against Blake when I was aced Blake when I was kidnapped recently with Abigail said they were proud and that I would definitely be a strong Luna to help Norman run his pack. "Who was Blake to you?" Andrew asked after a few minutes. "If HES got this much of a grudge against you, then he had to have known you personally, right? Last I heard, Norman and that guy's packs were holding some sort of alliance truce." "They were," I said as I looked to Norman before looking down at my hands in my lap. "Until Norman appointed me as his replacement Luna." "Why?" Sean asked, speaking up finally and causing me to turn my attention to him. "I would be Blake's rejected mate," I said, and watched as both their expressions turned to that of shock. "I grew up with Blake. We had been friends, but when we learned I was to be his mate, everything changed. Norman didn't even know it was his pack that beat and tortured me until we went to the pack house for my first assignment as his new Luna. He did all of this to you," Andrew said, looking at me with a sad look in his eyes. "Because you were his mate." "Said I was weak," I said with a shrug. "That his father wouldn't allow him to take such a weak mate as his Luna. That's when the fun began. Well, fun for him anyway." I felt Norman tense up by me and quickly placed my hand on his thigh that I was sitting on. This was still a topic the two of us didn't like discussing if we didn't have to. His wolf had been furious that day in my old pack house when Blake insulted me right in front of him. "Well, he won't get a chance to hurt you again," Sean said, causing me to look over at him as he smirked. "Andy and I will ensure he can't get close to you ever again without a fight." I watched with a smile as they both stood to their feet, claiming they were going to go to their rooms to rest and relax. Standing to my feet as well, I walked over to Sean first as he was closer and gave him a quick hug. I repeated the action with Andrew before watching as they both left out of Norman's office before I walked back over to him. You know Sean means what he said, right? Norman asked as he placed his hands on my hips as I sat down on his lap facing him so that I was straddling him. Goofy and Andy won't allow you to come into any more danger while they're here. We'll take care of this problem and then be done with it. I know, I said, smiling as I placed a light kiss on his lips. And for that, I'm thankful that I can say they're our allies. And your most trusted friends, I'm sure. He smiled and nodded before lifting his hand and using it to guide my lips right back to his. Chapter 21. Are we really going on a picnic? Abigail asked as she peered up at me while we stood in the kitchen. Me packing all the food we were taking out with us. Yes, we are, I said, smiling down at her. Norman's taking the two of us out into a meadow to some privacy away from the others. And it'll be a great way for us all to bond a little more. Doesn't he have to watch the pack, though? She asked curiously. I said, nodding as I finished loading the food. But he has got someone watching it today for him so that he can do this with us. Now go upstairs and change. Yes, Mommy, she said before running out of the kitchen and up the stairs to her room. I smiled and shook my head before I caught sight of the ring on my finger once again. It's been 2.5 weeks since both Sean and Andrew arrived after Norman contacted them. That means it's been 3.5 weeks since Norman and I got engaged. I smiled as I rubbed my thumb on my right hand over the ring on my left finger, enjoying the fact that I finally found someone who would take care of me and treat me right. At that second, the overwhelming urge to throw up suddenly hit me out of nowhere. Fighting back that urge, I took a deep breath as my hands grasped the counter in front of me while I closed my eyes and willed myself to not have to run to the bathroom and puke my guts up and row in this outing for Abigail, Norman, and myself. When the urge passed, I felt myself sigh almost in relief before a voice startled me from behind. Riley, are you okay? Matt's voice said from behind me, causing me to spin around. Huh, I said, looking at him. Yeah, I'm fine. You sure? He asked, looking at me concerned. Yeah, I said, smiling. I think it was probably what I ate this morning. Something just didn't agree with me today is all it is. It'll be all right. He gave me one final skeptical look before nodding and walking out of the pack house, turning back around to face the now packed basket of food. I decided it was time for me to head upstairs and get changed as well for this small outing for just the three of us. Walking by Abigail's door, I peered in to see she was fully dressed and trying to tie her shoes. Hi, Mommy, she said, smiling up at me. Can you help me, please? Sure, I said, smiling as I walked into the room and knelt down in front of her feet as she sat on her little bed, waiting for me to tie her shoes so we could get going as soon as Norman and I were ready. After Norman and I were ready, and Norman informed the pack member he was leaving in charge to only contact him if it was a dire emergency, the three of us left to the meadow that was quickly becoming mine and Norman's spot away from the pack. After Norman found us a nice spot to lay the blanket out that HED brought along, the two of us were laid back on it while Abigail ran around giggling as she chased a couple of butterflies she'd found, trying with all her might to catch them. Mommy, come play with me, she said, stopping as she turned to smile at me. I'm sorry, sweetie, I'm a little tired right now, I said with a sad smile. Baby, later, okay? Okay, she said as her smile dropped a little before a passing butterfly caught her attention and she was off chasing it again. You all right? You all right? Norman asked after a couple minutes, getting my attention away from the running and laughing child before us. Yeah, just a little tired, I said, smiling over at him. You'd keep me up half the night. I sent him a wink as he leaned over and playfully nuzzled into the crook of my neck. He said with a smirk evident in his voice before he pulled back slight and smiled at me, his blue eyes peering up at me. And I'm not complaining now, I said, smiling back down at him. I'm all right. I promise, Norman. If there was something to worry about, I'd tell you. His eyes regarded me for a moment before he nodded, believing that I would tell him if something was up. And after all we'd been through in a short amount of time, I would. I leaned down, placing a light kiss on his lips before pulling back and looking over to Abigail as she continued to run and play, having a blast out in the meadow. By the time we finally called it a day, Abigail was tuckered out, so Norman was carrying her as she slept with her head on his shoulder while I was carrying the now empty bag that had our food in it at one time. "I'm going to go put her to bed," Norman said as he made his way towards the stairs once we were back inside the pack house. Okay, I said before holding the bag up. "I'm just going to put this stuff away." I watched as he nodded before made his way upstairs with Abigail still sound asleep in his arms. I smiled before turning and walking into the kitchen and began to unpack the bag. I was just about finished with putting everything away when this sudden dizzy spell hit. I grabbed a hold of the countertop in front of me and tightly shut my eyes, willing the dizziness to go away before Norman came back and started to worry over nothing. When the dizziness finally went away, I was startled when I felt a pair of arms wrap around my waist. "Are you sure you're all right?" Norman asked as I felt his warm breath fin across the back of my neck as he spoke. "Yeah," I whispered as I placed my smaller hands on his as I leaned back against him while he rested his head on my shoulder. "I'm all right. I've just been doing a lot lately when it comes to helping with the pack and getting ready for whatever Blake might have planned." "Why don't you go upstairs and take it easy then?" he said as he placed a gentle kiss on the curve of my neck near where his mark was. "No, I can't," I said as I moved my head back to give him better access out of habit. "I want to go see Janet at A before it gets too late in the evening. I'll rest afterwards, I promise." He pulled his lips away from my neck and placed his hands on my shoulders, turning me around to face him as he seemed to peer into my soul with that blue-eyed gaze of his. "You better, you better," he said, "or I'll tie you up to my bed and never let you leave." "I didn't know you were into that kinky stuff," I said, smiling up at him as I placed my hand on his chest. I watched as his blue eyes darkened as he looked down at me. "There's a lot about me you don't know," he said, his voice deeper than normal. "Guess I'm going to have to spend some time getting to know you better then," I said, smiling up at him before standing on my toes and pressing a quick kiss to his lips. "I'll be back later, then I'll go upstairs and rest like you suggested." "I promise." I pulled out of his grasp and made my way towards the front door, feeling his eyes on me as I darted outside and began my way to Jenna and Matt's place. As I made my way to their home, I spotted some of the pack members walking about, either on their way home or just taking a short stroll before nightfall. "Evening, Luna," a woman said, smiling at me as she bowed slightly. "Evening," I said, smiling before noticing the baby bump she was sprouting. "You look about ready to pop." "I feel like it," she said, smiling down as she placed her hand on her protruding stomach. "Everything you go through in the process, like the pain in the end or the nausea in the beginning, is well worth it in the end." "I'm sure it is," I said, smiling at her as she looked back up at me. "Maybe one day soon you can give the alpha one," she said as a blush quickly crossed my face. I glanced back behind me. Towards the house, a thought crossed my mind that I hadn't even considered before now. "Yeah, maybe," I said before looking back to her and smiling. "If you'll excuse me." "Of course," she said, nodding. "Have a good night, Luna." You too, I said before turning and continuing on my way towards Jenna's. If I was right about what was now creeping into my mind after what was discussed between me and her, then I had a bad feeling about the timing of it all. When I finally reached Matt and Jenna's home, I was trying to keep calm so I didn't look so freaked out when I truly was. I was just worried. Walking up the steps and knocking on the door, I stood there waiting for the door to open. When it finally opened, I was grateful that it was Jenna who opened the door. "Hey," she said, smiling. "Jenna, I need help," I said instead of greeting her back with hey as well. Chapter 22. "What's wrong, really?" Jenna asked, noticing the panic that was seeping through my voice no matter how hard I tried to conceal it. "Okay, so all day I've having a really off day," I said as she allowed me to walk into her house. "It started this morning while I was packing up the food for that picnic I went on with Norman and Abigail today. I got really nauseous over nothing." "Yeah, Matt said you looked a little pale this morning," she said, nodding. "Are you all right?" "I don't know it," I said, shaking my head. Then when we were out in our meadow, Abigail wanted me to play with her, but I was tired. Norman got concerned, so I passed it off as just the result of him keeping me up most of the night last night. And then when we got back home, Norman took Abigail upstairs to put her to bed while I unpacked everything. I got so dizzy, Jenna. I looked at her as she stared right back at me. I could see those wheels in her head spinning as she processed what I was saying. When I was on my way over here to visit, I said when she didn't make a move to speak, I was stopped by a very pregnant woman. That's when she put it all into perspective for me. Jenna, I think I might be pregnant. Riley, that's great news, Jenna said, smiling and hugging me. What's got you so worried about being pregnant if you are? It's just I don't want to get Norman's hopes up when I'm not really sure about it, I said. And it's just the timing of it all. What with the threat from Blake and everything. I'm scared something will happen. We've got Andy and his pack here, she said, smiling at me. And then Sean and his pack are really close by. They won't let anything happen to you. But come on. Before I had a chance to ask where we were going, she grabbed a hold of my wrist and pulled me further into her house and up the stairs to the bathroom that went with hers and Matt's room. When she pulled me into the bathroom, she began digging through the cupboard looking for something. She said triumphantly as she straightened back up and showing me the unopened pregnancy test. I don't think I want to know why you have one here, I said, shaking my head as she handed it over to me. Matt wants more, she said, smiling, and I keep some just in case I have a late period. Here, take this test. It'll be out in my room waiting for you to get done. Before I even had a chance to protest, she had placed the box into my hands and walked out the door, closing it behind her as she went. Sighing, I looked down to the box in my hand and read the instructions on what to do. Taking care of my business and then washing my hands after placing the stick on the counter in the bathroom. I opened the door so that Jenna could come in and wait with me. You know he'll be overjoyed if you are pregnant, right? She asked, looking at me as she noticed the worried look on my face. Yes, I know, I said, nodding and giving her a weak smile. I'm just really scared about the timing of it all. I don't want anything bad to happen to Norman or the baby if I am in fact pregnant with his child now. Well, only one way to see if you are not, she said, smiling as she walked over to the counter where the test was sitting. What does it say? I asked when she didn't make a move to speak after staring at it. When she turned around to face me, I automatically knew just what was on that test, if her smile was anything to go by. Riley, she said, grinning, you're pregnant. You and Norman are going to have a baby. She ran up to me and hugged me, while I barely managed to put my arms around her as I was in a little bit of shock over the news. When we finally pulled away from each other, reality hit me as I looked down to my still flat stomach. A smile made its way onto my face as a tear of joy slipped down my cheek before I looked back up to Jenna. This is really happening, I said, smiling at her as I saw her with her own tears in her eyes. HES going to be so happy, really, she said, smiling at me. I went to open my mouth to agree with her, but I was cut short by the sound of the front door slamming open and the sound of footsteps running up the stairs. Baby, what's wrong? Jenna asked when a panicked Matt ran into the bathroom where we still were standing. You two need to get to the shelter under the pack house, he said, out of breath as both of us loathed the floor, looking back to him. Why? I asked out in a whisper, fearing the answer I knew was going to come from his mouth. Blake's made his move, he said, looking at me. They're attacking the pack now. Sean's on his way with his pack warriors to help. Where's Norman? I asked, even more panicked now. HES outside waiting on you, Matt said, knowing Norman was outside their house waiting. I didn't wait for the other to before I ran down their stairs and out the front door, straight into his arms. Riley, go with Matt, Jenna and Leighton to the shelter under the pack house, Norman said as he hugged me tightly and rested his head on top of mine. I don't want you fighting with Blake. There's no telling what he might do. He pulled back to look at me as I nodded before his attention turned to look behind me. Looking over my shoulder, I spotted Matt, Jenna, and Leighton in the doorway of their home as they looked down to where we stood. Stay close to them, he said, kissing my forehead. It'll be back for you when this is over. Norman, wait, I said, quickly grabbing his arm as he went to turn and run towards where the battle was happening between his pack and Blake's. Riley, I don't have time for this, he said, looking at me, pleading with me to understand. But you need to know something. I said as I held his wrist tightly so he wouldn't pull away from me. "No what?" he asked, looking into my eyes. "Really, I really need to get back to the others." "I know," I said, "but God forbid if something happens out there tonight. But you need to know. Norman am pregnant." I watched his face, gagging his reaction as his mind tried to grasp what it was I just said. "What?" he whispered out after a couple of minutes, the sight of tears forming in his blue eyes filling my heart with joy. "Am pregnant," I whispered just as softly. "I just found out before Matt came to tell us to get to the pack house." "You're really pregnant?" he asked, a smile moving to his face as he momentarily forgot about the threats around us. "Yes," I said, smiling just before he lifted me up and spun me around, causing me to laugh. The second he let my feet touch the ground again, he had both of his hands on either side of my face as he brought me into a deep kiss, my own hands instantly finding a place to rest on his hips. "Norman," Jenna called out, causing us to pull apart. "Celebrate later, okay? You have to worry about keeping her safe with the threat of Blake in the territory." That seemed to snap him back to reality as he looked to Jenna as she still stood on the porch with her mate and child looking at us, nodding once. Norman looked back to me with a determination in his eyes that I knew was from the sudden need to protect his family. To protect his now growing family. "Riley, please be careful," he said as he rested his head against mine and peered into my eyes. I will," I said, nodding against his head. "I'll have Matt and Jenna with me as we make a run for the shelter. But Norman, I want you to commit back to me after this. I won't be able to do this on my own. Our child will need their father too. They'll make it back," he said, placing a quick kiss on my lips. "I promise." I looked up into his blue eyes as he rested his hands on my cheeks. I could feel the traitor tears starting to slip down as I stared into his eyes. I was scared, in more ways than one. I was scared that something would happen to me or the baby, and Norman would be left without an heir again, but even more broken than before. I was scared that something would happen to him, and our baby would be left without a father to help raise it. "Riley, come on," Jenna's voice said as she snapped me out of my thoughts. "We gotta go," looking back to her and Matt. I nodded before quickly following after them towards what I was hoping safety. Chapter 23. Matt, having heard what I told Norman, stayed right beside me the whole time we were running towards the pack house and where the shelter was underneath it. With the threat of danger all around us, it seemed that the run to the house was longer than normal. It didn't really help I could hear and see the fighting going on around us. I found myself stopping, just yards away from the pack house, the moment I spotted Norman's black wolf charging at one of Blake's own as they went after a pack member who was trained to fight. I stood there watching, as he attacked a rust-colored wolf, killing it instantly before moving on to the next threat. It hurt, watching my old pack fighting with my new one. Over me of all things. I knew I should have been running with Matt and Jenna. I knew I shouldn't be standing there watching the battle as it raged on. But I cowled and forced my feet to move as I watched the two packs fight each other. Most of my old pack really loved me. Most of them didn't know what happened to me. They were good people, the ones I knew best. So it makes me wonder just what it was that Blake told them to get them to attack such a large and strong pack like Norman's. The wolves I saw fighting my old pack that I didn't recognize. I figured they belonged to Andy's pack, or maybe scenes if HED made it back by now with his own warriors to help us. That was another thing getting to me. People I didn't even know were fighting alongside Norman to help protect me. Then it hit me. I didn't know where Abigail was. I didn't know if she was still inside the pack house, upstairs in her room fast asleep, or if she was out here looking for me. That thought in mind, I looked around panicked, looking for the small child that had become my daughter in the time it'd been here with this pack. Turning to the house, I ran past where Matt, Jenna, and little Leighton were standing by the cellar doors that led to a different part of the basement, away from where we kept prisoners. "Riley, what are you doing?" I heard Matt shout as soon as he spotted me run by him. "I have to find Abigail," I called back, not looking over my shoulder as I ran inside and straight for the stairs. "Going to her room first." "Abigail," I shouted, running through the door to her room. "Mommy," she shouted, spooked by my sudden burst into her room. "CM on, sweetie, we've gotta get to shelter," I said, running over to where she sat on her bed, picking her up. I held her close as I quickly began making my way down the stairs and straight for the front door, standing on the steps to the pack house for a second. I looked around before noticing Matt still standing by the cellar doors, but Jenna and Leighton must be been already inside where it was safe. "Run to Matt," I said, putting her down and pushing her towards where Matt stood before I straightened up. I needed one last look at Norman, or his wolf, just to know he was still alive before I went down into that shelter to hide. "Riley, come on," Matt shouted, causing me to look over at him. I cowed, not until I knew Norman was safe. Looking back to the fighting wolves around me, I finally spotted his black wolf attacking another. Seeing he was okay, I turned to run for Matt, almost making it to him and the safety of the shelter when something grabbed me from behind. "Riley, Lele," Matt shouted as a hand wrapped itself tightly around my neck and slowly cutting off my air supply. The smell that was filling my nose was that of a familiar scent. It was Blake's hand that was wrapped around my throat. It was his hand that was cutting off my air supply and slowly killing me. "Riley," I heard Matt shout again, my vision beginning to get blurry and black spots beginning to appear. I looked over towards Matt, my eyes heavy as my body started to shut down from the lack of oxygen. "Mommy," I heard Abigail scream, watching as Matt grabbed a hold of her and held her tight to keep her from running towards me. As the darkness began to slowly spread across my vision, I heard a loud and angry roar coming from somewhere. I could see Matt looked terrified as he looked over to where I'd last seen Norman fighting. Before I had time to comprehend what had Matt so scared, I felt Blake being jerked away from me and then me myself falling to the ground. Gasping for the much-needed oxygen, I sat there on the ground before I felt a pair of hands grip a hold of my shoulders. As my vision cleared, I looked up to see that it was Matt's hands on my shoulders. Instantly, my attention went back to the cellar doors to see Jenna holding a sobbing Abigail, but her attention was on me and Matt. It was directed off to my right. Glancing over, I figured out why Matt had looked so scared and why Jenna was now staring off to my right. There stood Norman's black wolf, hovering over Blake, his teeth bared as he snarled and towered over him. Apparently, Norman's wolf had completely taken over when he saw that I was in danger, and on instinct he went into protective mode. If you thought that a normal male werewolf was dangerous when he had a mate and unborn child to protect, then you didn't know shit compared to an alpha werewolf. Mated with Norman, I could feel the rage just rippling off of him through the bond that deformed when we completely mated nearly a month ago. I could even feel the fear coming from Blake as he stared down Norman's jaws. He had every right to be scared. Norman has waited a long time to finally have a child, and now that I'm pregnant, his protectiveness over me more than tripled. With Norman being older and stronger, Blake was beginning to see the mistake HED made in challenging Norman a moment he kidnapped me and Abigail. Blake was too scared to shift into his wolf to attempt to protect himself, although it would have been futile. With Matt's help, I stood to my feet as he wrapped his arms around my shoulders to keep me standing straight up. "Blake, Blake," I called out, catching both his and Norman's attention. When Norman's blue eyes locked with mine, I nodded I was okay before looking to the terrified Blake beneath him. "You should know," I said, watching him. "Being an alpha yourself, it's not smart to attack Alpha's pregnant mate." I watched as his face paled as what I said hit him just before Norman whipped back around, his jaw wrapping around Blake's neck before he gave a sickening twist, and the sound of his neck breaking reached my ears. As Norman released his jaw from around Blake's neck, his body slumped down to the ground like the dead weight he now was. I pulled away from Matt, grabbing a pair of shorts from another pack member as I watched Norman shift out of his black wolfen back into his human state. Walking over to him, I handed him the shorts as he stared down at the dead body that belonged to my ex-mate. "It's over," I whispered, glancing to him once HED pulled his shorts up and wrapped his arms around me, resting his chin on my shoulder. "It is," he said, his voice only a whisper as well. I'm sorry, I said, looking up into his blue eyes as he looked down at me in confusion. I shouldn't have stayed out in the open like that. You wanted me to protect myself, and I ended up placing myself and our baby in danger instead. It's okay, he said, turning me around and placing both hands on my face. I could feel your worry. Had our roles been switched, I know I would have done the same thing. And just grateful I was where I could see what happened. Or at least hear Abigail like I did. I smiled up at him before I heard a small voice. Mommy, Abigail yelled as she ran over towards Norman and me. I smiled and pulled out of his embrace long enough to pick her up before he wrapped his arms around both of us and placed his head in the crook of my neck. So, Jenna said, walking up to us with Leighton in her arms, can I start helping plan the wedding now that Blake is no longer an issue? Everyone around her started laughing, including herself, while Norman and I just smiled and held each other a little bit longer. Chapter 24. CM on you look gorgeous, Jenna said as she helped me fix the dress I was wearing. It's been about a month since Blake and his packet act, and since Norman ended everything revolving around him. He gave them members of the pack that belonged to Blake a choice. They could live peacefully here with us, or they could go rogue and look for a new pack, hoping for the best like I got. I feel fat and you've got me in a tight, form-fitting dress, I complained as I placed my hands flat against my sides as I pressed down on some of the wrinkles that deformed when I sat down. You haven't even gained any weight, really, Jenna said, rolling her eyes at my comment. And you're glowing. So stop fidgeting. You're beautiful. I grumbled incoherently and turned back to face my reflection in the mirror. I was wearing a white wedding dress with a lacy design over it that hugged my body until it flared out at my hips and then flows down until it barely dragged the floor below. I had on a pair of silver heels to go with the dress. Jenna found a necklace in her endless supply of jewelry that was a crescent moon with a blue sphere connected with it. I had a pair of diamond studs in for something simple. My makeup was done lightly so that it didn't overshadow the beauty of everything else. The only ounce of color I had besides the blue sphere on my necklace was the bouquet of flowers, which had pinks, purples, and whites in it. My hair was pulled back into a low bun. A few strands of hair left loose to frame my face with my veil attached to the bun. "Are you ready?" Jenna asked, snapping me out of my mental thoughts of what I was wearing. "Not really," I said, smiling weakly at her. "But I am ready to be married to this man." "It's natural to be nervous," she said, smiling as she walked over to me and hugged me tightly. "But see him on, let's go. Every onus waiting on us." I smiled and nodded as she pulled away from me. After a little over a month of being engaged, I was getting married to the man who deprotected me from my ex-mate and took me in when I was a rogue for several years after running away. He showed me how I should have been treated as a mate. I think in the end, we were both good for each other. "Mommy," Abigail said, running up to me in her little flower girl dress with a smile on her face. "You look beautiful, sweetie," I said, smiling down at her as she beamed up at me. "So do you, Mommy," she said. "See him on, let's go," Jenna said, standing beside us. "Abigail, you go first, okay?" "Okay," she said before turning around before walking out the door and down the aisle that would lead to where Norman was standing. I had 3 bridesmaids, Jenna and both Sean and Andy's mates. I didn't want a maid of honor because I didn't know most of the pack well enough to have a maid of honor and the bridesmaids, so we stuck with 3 bridesmaids. Sean and Andy had left with their packs after the battle with Blake, then returned later with their immediate family. They had arrived early enough where I got to spend a little time with it, just the 4 of us. Me, Jenna, and their mates. They helped me to understand what was to be expected from me as a Luna, but they also said that it'd come naturally to me. And just like Sean and Andy, they both said that they were happy that Norman had found someone else, and even more overjoyed when they found out I was pregnant. By the end of their first day there, they were already trying to make plans for a baby shower for later on when it was closer to my due date. I hugged the 3 others before they turned and began walking down the aisle ahead of me. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the door and stood there with my bouquet in hand as I watched them walk. When it was my turn, the music began and all heads turned in my direction, but my only focus was on the man standing at the end of the aisle dressed in a suit. As I slowly made my way down the aisle, I could see Sean, Andy, and Matt beside him, but my focus went back to where he stood with that smile on his face. Beautiful, he whispered to me when I stood next to him as he placed a gentle kiss on my cheek before we both turned to the man before us. I stood there with Norman, listening to the guy say the same thing that was always said at a wedding before the bride and groom said their vows. And finally married. I just kept glancing over at Norman, just ready to be finally married to him so we could await the arrival of our baby as husband and wife. By the time we got to the dinner after the initial wedding, Norman and I hadn't left each other's side. The whole time we were holding hands and smiling as people from Norman's pack gave their congratulations to us. Most, if not all, of the pack knew about me now being pregnant with Norman's baby, and they were ecstatic. The news of an heir for the alpha title was welcomed greatly after knowing of the struggles Norman and his first mate had gone through to get pregnant, but now here I am pregnant without even trying. "Mommy," Abigail called out, snapping me from my thoughts as I looked over at her to see she wanted in my lap. Picking her up, I sat her down and hugged her tightly before glancing over at Norman to see him smiling at the sight. "Can I call you Daddy now that you married my mommy?" she asked shyly. The entire room went silent, having heard the little girl's question and waiting to see how Norman would respond to it. I glanced up at Norman to see him smiling down at the little girl seated in my lap. "Of course," he said, smiling as she grinned at him and moved over to sit on his lap and hugged him tightly. The room erupted into a cheer of AWS as he hugged her back, just as tightly. "Now," he said once he pulled away from the hug, "how about a dance with my two beautiful girls?" I smiled and watched as he stood to his feet with Abigail resting on his hip before he held out his arm to me. I reached up and took his hand, allowing him to help me out of my seat before leading the way towards the makeshift dance floor where other couples were dancing, including Matt and Jenna. Norman passed Abigail to me before wrapping his arm around the two of us once I had her settled on my hip as his other hand grabbed my free one. As he started to sway us gently to the slow song playing background, he leaned forward and pressed a light kiss to my lips. I heard Abigail giggling before she pushed us back, causing us to both smile over at her. I leaned closer to her and placed a soft kiss on her cheek before looking back to Norman and smiling. All I could see in his blue eyes at that moment was pride and absolute love for me and Abigail in our arms. Looking around the room as we slowly moved with the meet, I could see other couples joining and in dancing as well. I saw Andy and his mate, Sean and his mate, and then I spotted Jen and Matt as they both were dancing close to where we were. As if sensing that I was looking, I watched as Jenna turned around to face me. Pulling away from Matt, she walked over to me. I pulled away from Norman and handed him Abigail before facing her just as she wrapped me in a hug. "I'm so happy," she whispered. "I just knew from the minute I saw you in his office that something would happen between the two of you. I knew you both were broken from losing a mate by death or, in your case, rejection. Congratulations." I smiled and hugged her back tightly as I felt tears slowly falling from my eyes. Those stupid pregnancy hormones were already working on me and making me way more emotional than I should be. I hadn't felt this loved in a long time. And now I was married to a man who's treated me right from the moment I met him. A daughter that I adopted not too long after coming here. A best friend that is more like a sister than anything. And a baby on the way. If you would have told me the day I went rogue and ran from the one person who was to love me but rejected me that it'd end up this happy, I would have called you a liar because I felt in that moment when I ran that no one would ever love me. But now, here I am as happy as I should have been to start with. And you know what? I wouldn't change a thing. Epilogue. You're doing great, really. Norman's voice called out to my ears as I felt him holding my hand. It's been months since he and I got married, and now here I am, once again in the hospital ward of the pack house. "Shut up," I growled out as I squeezed his hand tightly just as another sharp pain went through my body. "It's your fault I'm in here right now like this. It takes two to tango, sweetheart," he said, laughing as he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to my temple. "Remember that. You're just as much to blame as me in this." "I hate you," I growled out while his smile only seemed to grow. "That's right, I'm finally delivering our firstborn. The pack has been on edge these past few weeks as the day drew closer. And now it's here, and I'm sure everyone in the pack can hear me shouting at their alpha and blaming him for getting me into this mess. But who am I kidding? I wouldn't want to change this moment. Every person in the werewolf community dreams of the day they can happiness to their mate while doing so. But with me being mated to the alpha, and our child being of alpha blood, I'd have to endure much more pain than the average person, which in my opinion is seriously messed up. You're doing great, Luna, the pack doctor said from between my legs as they looked up at me with a smile. I can already see the head. I sat up slightly to look down at where they sat before flopping back and groaning. I was tired, thirsty, hungry, and a serious amount of pain. And if I asked for something to eat or drink, all they'd give me were these damn ice chips. You hear that? Norman whispered against my head. Our baby will be here soon. I gave him a death glare, but all he did was laugh. All right, Luna, the doctor said, peering up at me once more. Time to give me a big push. Okay. I scream out in pain as a strong contraction hits me hard. I grip Norman's hand tighter as I use it to help me to push through the pain and to push just like the doctor said to do. I've been doing this for hours, pushing every time the doctor tells me to. But when the sound of a cry fills my ears and the contractions stop, I feel tears flowing down my eyes as the doctor stands with a small form in their arms. I feel Norman's hand tighten around mine this time as we both see the small creature that was part of him and part of me. Congratulations, the doctor said, walking closer with the newborn infant. It's a boy. I smiled as they handed me the baby, now wrapped in a little blanket. When he was nestled safely in my arms, I looked up at Norman to see him smiled proudly at the baby resting in my arms. What are we going to call him? I asked, looking up at Norman as he looked to me. I was thinking, he said, looking down to the baby in my arms before looking back to me again. How about Caden? Caden? I said, trying it out. I like it. I looked back down at the baby in my arms as he slowly opened his eyes, revealing the same blue eyes as his father. I lifted my hand over him just as he reached his smaller one out and wrapped his tiny hand around one of my fingers. I think now I knew what it felt like to have carried a small life growing inside my body for so long before finally holding it in my arms. Mommy, I heard a little voice call out, causing me to look up and see Abigail standing in the door holding Jenna's hand as she, Jenna, Matt, and Leighton were standing there. Come say hi to your little brother Caden, I said, smiling at her as she let go of Jen's hand and ran for my bed and climbing up to stare at the little baby in my arms. How are you feeling? Jenna asked as she walked over with Matt and Leighton. Exhausted, I said, laughing, but overjoyed at the same time. Hes beautiful, she said, smiling down at the baby in my arms. He looked like his father, I remarked as I looked over at Norman as I spoke. How does it feel being a father finally? It feels great, he said as he leaned down and pressed a kiss to my forehead. I think I want more now. Slow yourself, I said, laughing. Let's take care of Abigail and Caden first, then we'll think about more. And that was how I found my place and my own happiness with someone I was ever truly to be destined with originally. And I couldn't be happier. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode of a story, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications for updates.